Welcome to the Beatles Merseyside, the companion volume to the Beatles Liverpool, and we're going to be showing places that the Beatles played outside the city centre, as well as meeting musicians and fans who saw them in the early 1960s. As we travel around the city and its suburbs, you're going to see 08 logos and Super Lamb banana sculptures, but more of that later. Hello, I'm Spencer Lee and welcome to the first stop on the Beatles Merseyside. We're here in Southport. This is about 20 miles north of Liverpool and we've come on the Liverpool-Southport line and the journey takes about 40 minutes. Southport is a very historic seaside town, but is also very historic from the Beatles' point of view too. There's a lot of sites here connected to the Beatles, and indeed once Brian Epstein signed the Beatles in December 1961, it seemed the first thing he wanted to do was conquer Southport. Let's find out about it. We'll go down to the promenade first of all and to the Floral Hall. We're inside the Floral Hall now and we're looking at the glass dome. It's wonderful that so much of the original work has been preserved in here. It's an Art Deco building within the Southport Theatre complex. The Beatles played here 4 times, twice in 1962, twice in 1963. The first time they were here in 1962, in February 62, traditional jazz was the order of the day and they were on a rock and trad spectacular. Then they appeared in October around the time of the release of Love Me Do. And then in 1963, they were here in April. And that was shortly after they'd been on the New Musical Express Poll Winners concert where they did exceptionally well. Everybody was screaming for them by then. And then in October 1963, they were here just after they'd appeared on Sunday night at the London Palladium and the word Beatlemania had actually been coined. And someone who was there that night was the person that I met outside, Ron Ellis. He's written the Johnny Ace detective stories and also the book Southport Faces. So Ron, tell us about that day.
Well, I used to collect rock and roll records and I wanted to buy American records you couldn't get over here. And luckily I had a pen pal in America called Ronnie Kellerman. He used to send me catalogues of all the latest releases and I would order them from the catalogue and have them sent to me here in Southport. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford to keep them, so what I used to do was to tape the records and then try and sell them on to other people and get some more money for another lot. Now, I was managing groups at the time, local groups like the Smokestacks and the Diplomats, the Mersey Four, the Jokers, and I used to know all the beat clubs in Southport, but of course the groups were very poor and they didn't have money. But the people who did have money were the big name Mersey groups who were starting to make it. People like the Searchers, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, and the Beatles. And I went to see the Beatles on stage. I went backstage to see them and told them I could get all these records for them. And they were made up, yeah, great, we'll have them, order them for us. So I ordered the records and I brought them down to the Floral Hall in the October booking in 1963. Now, by this time, the Beatles were big name in the press. And my mother, I lived with my mother at the time across the road, my mother was absolutely made up to think the Beatles were actually going to be coming round, because I'd said to them that when they came to Southport, after they finished the show, they could come back across the road to my house, have some supper, and would sort out all the records. And my mother was telling all her friends at the Whist Drive, the Beatles are coming round tonight, just get all the sausage rolls and meat pies in. And I rolled up on the night, went to the dressing room, and I found I couldn't get in. There were swarms of press photographers and journalists all around the place. That afternoon, it had been announced that they were going to be on the Royal Variety performance, and every reporter in England had made a beeline for Southport's Floral Hall, and you just couldn't get in the dressing room. John Lennon came out, he said, "Look, mate, I'm sorry, we can't get to your house. A limousine's waiting outside, taking us to London," and that was the last time, really, I saw them properly. I couldn't give them the records, they never came round, the sausage rolls weren't eaten, But a few months later, they did the Christmas show at the Liverpool Odeon, and I went in then and took the records and collected the money and never saw them again.
Yeah. Now, outside the Floral Hall, there's the Queen's Hotel, and that's got a Beatles connection too with what's called the Club Django. Can you tell us about that,
Yeah,
Ron?
the Club Django was run by a local entrepreneur called Paul Bruford. He hired the Queen's Hotel and put groups on. Paul used to have venues all over Lancashire. Saturday night he'd have perhaps about 7 or 8 venues in which he was putting the bands, and as I was working as an agent at the time, I used to book all the groups for him. And on a Thursday night at the Club Django we had groups like Freddie and the Dreamers and Herman's Hermits, the Big Three, Rory Storm, all the usual Merseybeat groups, and it was a really very popular night. The ballroom at the back of the Queen's Hotel was used. It held about 300 people, and as I say, the Beatles were about the most popular group that ever played there.
So the Beatles played at the Queen's Hotel once in 1962, and they played twice in 1962 at the Floral Hall and twice in 1963. That's 5 times in all. We're now going to go somewhere where they played 8 times in Southport, and that's a Kingsway casino. I'm not quite sure what it is now, but let's go and find out. It's about 5 minutes from here. We're here at the Kingsway now. I thought it had closed down, but there are some signs of life here, so maybe it's reopening again. There was a lot of activity at the Kingsway in the early 1960s, and the Beatles played here 8 times, starting on the 21st of January 1962 for a promoter called Ron Appleby. And Ron, did you go and see the Beatles at the Kingsway?
I never saw them, but I used to book groups into the Kingsway. It was the marine rooms on the top floor, and that was where the Beatles played. And as Spencer said, they had the casino on the first floor, there was dining there, and they had big acts on in the middle 60s, Tom Jones, Engelbert Humperdinck. But in the early 60s, the Beatles were the stars of the Kingsway.
It was a good gig to get, wasn't it?
Oh, excellent gig to get, yeah, because everybody used to
Yeah.
go there. It was the really in place. All the Southport Smart Set used to go to the Kingsway.
And I know that when the Beatles first played here, Ron Appleby annoyed Brian Epstein because he gave away free photographs of the Beatles, and the girls who came along to the Kingsway took off the photograph of Pete Best. They cut the photo out and put the photo of Pete Best in the lapels, and so they were all going around shouting Pete Best, Pete Best, Pete Best. But unfortunately that didn't last too long for Pete Best. But when the Beatles played here in 1962, they originally got £25 a night. Ron Appleby unfortunately found that Brian Epstein was putting the price up as the Beatles became more and more popular, and so the Beatles were only here on 8 occasions, but they were here on a weekly basis. Now we're going to go up onto Lord Street now, the main shopping area in Southport, and we're going to go to a very obscure place that the Beatles played. So obscure that everybody will miss it. Hardly anyone knows that the Beatles played here, so let's go and find it. So 269, 271, 273 Lord Street, that's where the Beatles played. Next, that shop shut, next to a dirty, stinking alleyway. This is where the Beatles played. So Glen Park Club, tell us about it, Ron.
Well, I describe it as a dirty, stinking alley, Spencer. Yes, well, what used to happen, there was the Great Wall Restaurant was here in that empty shop. And underneath, you'd go down some steps in the entry, and the Glen Park Club was underneath. It was run by a man called Mac, who used to run the taxi service in Southport, and all the Southport groups used to play here regularly. Sunday afternoon was a good time for the Glen Park Club. Nothing else in town was open, and the Beatles played here.
So the Beatles played here in November 1961. The gig, I think, would have been arranged by Pete Best's mother, Mo, because they weren't signed up to Brian Epstein yet, and indeed this is one of the last gigs that they did before they did sign with Brian Epstein. Let's go across the road now and see some more places that the Beatles played. We're inside the Southport Arts Centre now, and we're inside a part that used to be the Cambridge Hall. And the ceiling here is exactly the same as it was. The rest is somewhat different. But the Beatles appeared here on the 26th of July 1962. And they were part of a show that Brian Epstein put together with Joe Brown and the Brothers and the Beatles. And they appeared here one day and the Tower Ballroom the next. And it was a very, very popular show indeed. They did very well here. And Joe Brown, in fact, had a lot of difficulty following the Beatles, but indeed he succeeded all right. This was just before Pete Best was actually sacked. And it is said that Brian Epstein did make overtures to Bobby Graham, who was drummer with the Brothers at the time, to see if he would like to take over from Pete Best. But nobody's actually substantiated those stories. Now, the Beatles also played at the Odeon Cinema in Southport, and this was in 1963. We can't really show you that venue now because it's a Sainsbury's and we probably get knocked over as we went into the aisles. But they played there in March 1963 on the Helen Shapiro tour, so they weren't top of the bill then, but they were back a few months later in August 63 where they were top of the bill on their own show. And Ron Ellis, like myself, was also there.
It was just the start of Beatlemania, really. It hadn't been coined, the phrase, but the attendance was fabulous, screaming all night. I went with a crowd of girls from Southport Library, and they were all enchanted by the Beatles, and there was mass hysteria in the audience, and the concert went down really well, and better than anything we'd seen with any of the other groups who played Southport, any of the other Merseyside groups.
Yes, I mean, I remember going with a girl called Virginia, actually, and people were screaming so much for the Beatles that she was sort of banging my arm like that. You know, people were really very emotional about it indeed. And what I think is quite nice from my own point of view is that I kept a record of all the songs that the Beatles sang that night. And here we are on a complete list, 26th of August 1963. Yeah. The Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Tommy Quickly, Gary and Lee, who sang I'll Never Get Over You, but I've soon forgotten about them. Tommy Quickly, who was another one of Epstein's artists. Right. Jerry and the Pacemakers, who get 8 songs, you see. The Foremost.
Got 4 songs.
Yep, recently reformed. And here's the Beatles here, and I can tell you exactly what they did. How about this?
And who sang them as well, Spencer?
Yes, indeed. Roll Over Beethoven, first of all, with George. Then we've got Thank You Girl, which was sung by John and Paul together. Chains, which George sang some of the verses for that, it says. A Taste of Honey, which was Paul's solo. Then we've got She Loves You, which was John and Paul together. I Saw Her Standing There, which was Paul. From Me to You, John and Paul together again. A lot of harmonies from them. Baby It's You, John. That was great, that number, I remember. Boys by Ringo, fairly late in the set, that, I think. And then the final number, the 10th number that they did, was Twist and Shout. John Lennon really bawling it out.
The interesting thing about that is that the songs that they hadn't written, there's about, I think, 4 there that they've written. Mm-hmm. But the other 6, I've got all those 6 records by the original artists. Because at the time, all the Merseyside groups used to sing songs which were covers of American songs. And the American covers were always a million times better. Mm-hmm. And I was quite amazed, really, when Merseyside took off as it did, because I thought, well, they're just doing watered-down copies. Yeah. But, of course, the Beatles wrote their own numbers, and that was the difference.
I thought that about the covers myself at the time, but now I think the Liverpool covers of the American songs have a real charm of their own.
Probably because there's so many of them that become a genre of their own, I think.
Yeah. And we're going to see Billy Kinsley later on, and I love the way in one of their songs they say "Wear your hair just for hair," which isn't a line that should be sung by Liverpool people, really. So the Odeon Cinema is now Sainsbury's, but there is a connection with that week in Southport in August 1963 that I can show you, because there's a lovely little tale on connected to the little theatre in Southport, because the Beatles actually did something there the week that they were at the Odeon.
That's right.
So let's go across the road and see the little theatre.
Excellent.
Well, we're in the Little Theatre now, and it's wonderfully preserved. Ron, you're actually going to a show here tonight.
I certainly am. I do all the show reviews for the Southport Champion newspaper. The Little Theatre in Southport is the home of amateur dramatics in the town, and it's run by the Southport Dramatic Club, but many other societies put on plays and shows here.
Well, the Beatles didn't actually perform here as such, or at least not perform with an audience. The story is most intriguing, actually, because they were making a documentary for the BBC called The Merseyside, and they wanted to film the Beatles while they were appearing at the Odeon. But the BBC found that the audience were just making far too much noise and they couldn't get a decent recording. So they said to the Beatles, come here in one morning in August 1963, 27th of August 63, and we'll film you without an audience. And that is what was done. John Lennon had some trouble with his throat at the time, and the manager here had to go out and get some Zoobs for him. They filmed it, and then if you watch the film, the documentary, The Merseyside, you'll see how it's cut in with an audience. Before we go to the next venue, let's have another look around this splendid building, because it has been so well preserved. Ron, just how old is it?
It was built in the 1920s, Spen. It was built by the Liverpool Victoria Insurance Company, but in 1937 the Southport Dramatic Club bought this part of the building and it kept it as a theatre for amateur dramatics in Southport, and of course that's maintained till today.
And what I love is that on some of the seats you've got the names of the original patrons. So let's have a look at a few of those and then move on to the next Beatles site. We've now been to all the gigs that the Beatles played in Southport, and we've moved a couple of miles towards Liverpool to the suburb of Birkdale. And there are a couple of places that the Beatles actually played here. We're actually at the Air Training Corps building here. It was the Air Training Corps building in 1961 as well, when the Beatles played here, March 1961. So this is the Beatles' earliest appearance in this area. Ron, have you anything to say about this?
Well, this was just a local sort of dance hall. You get kids from round about here who lived in Birkdale. At one time or another, they would have probably had these big bands and the small combos that they had in the 1950s. And then in the 60s, skiffle and rock and roll came in, and you just get local bands playing. So the Beatles probably cost no more coming from Liverpool than one of the local groups did.
They must have been great then, though, because they'd just come back from Hamburg, so they must have been firing on all cylinders.
Absolutely, yes. It's just like when they played at Litherland Town Hall, and everybody thought they were German because they'd come over from Hamburg. But probably created quite a stir. And of course this was only the first gig of the night, Spencer, you've got to remember. Because after they finished here, they packed their equipment up and went on to a suburb called Churchtown, on the other side of town, a district called Hyde Park, where they played the Labour Club there. So that's 2 gigs in a night, which of course was very common in those days.
So we're going to be leaving you now, Ron. It's been great seeing you today, going around all the Southport gigs with you. And I'll look forward to your next Johnny Ace novel, because your Johnny Ace detective stories always have a Merseybeat element in them, even though they're set in the present.
Well, Johnny Ace himself, you see, was a drummer in the 60s, so he brings in a lot of all the Merseybeat groups and the characters, and all real-life characters appear in the book as well, so the Merseybeat people who are still around today are often in the book as well.
Well, a lot of luck with that, Ron.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
And you,
And we've got just one more call in Southport now, because we're going to visit Councillor Sir Ron Watson, a Southport councillor who is quite convinced that the Beatles played somewhere that we don't actually know about. So let's find out what all that's about. Okay, well, Ron, you saw the Beatles perhaps over 100 times. Yeah, when did you first see them?
I actually first saw them, I think, towards the end of 1960. A friend took me down and I made a diary note that said he'd take me to see this new group called the Beatles, and I didn't think they were very good, which I think probably goes along the same lines as the Decca record guy. But during 1961, 1962, I probably did see them about 100 times in local venues, and they just improved beyond all recognition.
So you probably saw them just after they come back from Hamburg, did you?
Yes, I think the comments that everybody makes about it was Hamburg that turned them into the band they were are probably true. They were sensational during the end of 1961, 1962. As a rock and roll band, they were probably at their absolute peak then. And without a doubt, it was the experiences and the work they did in Hamburg that contributed hugely to that.
When you went to see them, did you think, I hope they do such and such a song tonight?
They had a repertoire of favourites. They would always usually start off with Hippie Hippie Shake or Some Other Guy. So you knew really that if you watched them for an hour or so, the chances were they would cover most of the songs you wanted to hear. But there would be times when they wouldn't. I mean, everybody always wanted to hear Twist and Shout. I used to enjoy John Lennon doing Stand By Me, and a lot of the rhythm and blues numbers, which a lot of people weren't actually very familiar with, but which I was, because I used to listen to these original American records in the first instance.
And whereas, for example, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Jerry Marsden would do all the lead vocals, one of the strengths of the Beatles was that they had 3 people who could sing in there. Well, 4 if you count Pete Best and Ringo.
I think that's true, and they mixed it up rather well. There are the stereotypes. I mean, Paul McCartney was often thought of as being the one that did, as it were, the softer numbers. It's not true if you listen to him doing things like Long Tall Sally. And as I say, John Lennon would do others from the Benny King stable and that type of thing. George Harrison was particularly good at things like the Coasters. I mean, Three Cool Cats was a great version when he did it. So there was always this variety, but there was also a degree of cohesion, which very few of the other groups on Merseyside actually had on a collective basis.
And what is quite unusual is that the Beatles had a real female following, and even when the females started screaming at them, the fellas still liked them.
I think that's right. I mean, most of us went to hear the music. When the girls started to scream, it started to get a bit annoying. But to me, there was an exaggeration over that. I mean, most people would go to their lunchtime sessions at the Cavern, and you would watch them for about 30 minutes at a time. There'd perhaps be anywhere between 50 and 100 people there. There wasn't any screaming. I mean, these were just people going down at lunchtime to see one of their favourite bands. It was very friendly. You know, they would break at lunchtime sessions. You would go. Paul McCartney was always one. If you bought them a hot dog and a hamburger, everybody was very pleased. So it was a very friendly atmosphere, and the fan adulation, if you like, really didn't manifest itself until much later.
And what would you say to them? You did so and so well today, or?
Yeah, I would often have very casual conversations, but I'd be quite intrigued to know where they got some of the numbers from. So George Harrison was always very helpful on things like that. George would say, well, this is an original record by so-and-so, and some of them were quite surprising. I mean, I remember being particularly taken with the version they did of I Just Don't Understand, which was a song recorded by Anne Margaret. Now, you wouldn't really think that that would be a Beatles-type song, but their version of it was tremendous, and I had no idea where the original came from. George told me, and then I went out and bought the original record.
Yeah. And did you see a big change when Brian Epstein came into the picture?
Yes, there were 2 parts to that. One, the informal friendliness of the lunchtime sessions, and other sessions did go by the board to a degree. They did become, as it were, in quotes, more professional. And there was a price to be paid for that. But in essence, if they were going to make the big time, they really had to make that sort of a move. But there were quite a lot of people on Merseyside at the time who thought, well, we are actually losing them. The band that became popular was not the band that we'd actually followed.
And you actually knew Brian Epstein or saw him in those early years, didn't you?
Yes, I saw him. I was actually in the Cavern. I remember it quite well. In '61, when he came in, I think for the first time at lunchtime to see them, and he stood out because, you know, somebody who's 25 and wears a suit and a cravat when everybody else is 15 or 16 does make an impression. And you would often see him in Nems, because most of us used to go down to the record store, if only to buy the original American versions of the songs we'd heard the Beatles produce. What we wanted, of course, were records that the Beatles had made, but they didn't make any until the first one came out, which of course was My Bonnie with Tony Sheridan. And that sold quite well, and I've still got an original copy of that.
Yeah. And what about Southport? Because you saw them quite a lot in Southport. What do you remember that?
I think they played more in Southport than people actually recall. I mean, I particularly remember the sessions they did in January, February, March of 1962, Well, in my view, they were at the peak as a rock and roll band, and they did a Monday night session at a place called the Kingsway Club. I think it was 12.5 pence to get in. And they really were good. But there was still that sort of informality. One or two occasions you would see them arrive, and Pete Best would say, "Can you give us a hand up with the drums?" and this sort of thing, because you had to come flights of stairs to get there. So there was still that friendly atmosphere. But as a tight rock and roll band, they really were at their peak then.
Yes, I mean, they'd just been signed up by Brian Epstein then, and I'm forming the impression that they'd hardly played Southport before Brian Epstein, and he thought, right, they can conquer Southport first of all, because they played all over the place in Southport.
Yes, they were quite a number of venues. I think the Kingsway were the best shows, but they also played at the Floral Hall. They played supporting Joe Brown when he played at the Southport Art Centre, as it now is. They played at a place called the Queen's Hotel, which is on the promenade opposite the Floral Hall. And I am quite sure in my own mind that they also played at a place called the Palace Hotel in Birkdale. The Palace Hotel was demolished many years ago. But I'm sure I saw them play there on a Saturday night towards the end of 1961. But I've never been able to get anybody to confirm that. I remember it, but I can't get anybody who can actually prove it.
So you might have been the only person in the audience.
I doubt it. I remember it because there was a trad band on, and the contrast between a trad band and the Beatles was fairly stark.
Yes, that was one of the odd things of those days, wasn't it? That you had the trad people going and the rock and roll people to the same shows. Yes,
I mean, the Cabin, I suppose, was partly responsible for that. As you know, it started off as a jazz club, then people sort of moved away. But in essence, the Merseybeat scene really flourished in 61, 62, 63. There were a range of marvellous bands that were playing, but the Beatles were, without a doubt, top of the list. They went on to popularity, and they changed. And I'm not making any criticism of that, but when you see pictures of them in the round collar suits and they're sipping, Coca-Cola through a straw, this was not the Beatles that a lot of us actually knew. So we lost something, but they gained tremendously.
And did you switch your allegiance to another Liverpool group then?
I mean, I always enjoyed King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. I always enjoyed the Big Three, the Searchers, the Undertakers. The Undertakers started to play quite regularly in Southport when the Beatles left. They were a great band.
Yeah, and what do you feel about what seems to be the revitalisation of Liverpool now?
I'm hugely impressed by it. I think the development that's taking place, particularly on the front, is absolutely marvellous, and it's revitalised the city. Very positive.
Yeah, and nobody realised for years about the potential of the Beatles. A lot of councillors sort of ignored them, didn't they? And that's made all the difference to Liverpool.
I actually think that's right. I had the conversation many times with the publicity people at Liverpool that they were simply not exploiting. One of the reasons I said that was I used to run travel companies. I used to travel all around the world, and when you said you were from Liverpool, it brought an automatic response. What about the Beatles? That was never reflected in the marketing that the city did for many, many years. But again, they're getting better at it now.
Yeah, and we're getting many different opinions on this. What's your take on Ringo Starr's outburst on the Jonathan Ross show?
Disarmingly honest, probably. I mean, if you were brought up in the area where Ringo was, and you end up living in Monaco, and you're a multi-millionaire, what is it that you're going to miss? And actually, the answer to that should really be, you need to retain some relationship with your roots. I mean, I don't come originally from this part of the world, but I do like to go back to where I was brought up. And he was just being, and he was a candid guy. He shouldn't have said it, really. And probably deep down, there will be something there which says, no, this is where I came from, and there are things here that made me, and I need to recognise that.
Well, Ron, it's been great to talk to you, and it's amazing the number of times you've seen the Beatles. I really envy you, so thank you very much indeed.
Okay, well done.
I hope you're beginning to see how important Southport was for the Beatles' development. They played about 8 or 9 venues in Southport, did about 20 gigs here, and they did it at a very important time in their development. They played here first with Pete Best in 1961, and they would have felt that when they were coming to Southport that this was a big thing, 20 miles away from Liverpool. It was like hitting the big time, really. And then they did play here when they hit the big time in August 1963, when the whole audience would be screaming for them. So we're now going to head off to Latham Hall in Seaforth, so we're travelling about 12 miles and going back towards Liverpool. We're in the Seaforth and Litherland area of Liverpool at the moment, which is about 5 miles from the city. And the Beatles played quite a lot at Latham Hall in Seaforth and at Litherland Town Hall. Unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, Litherland Town Hall is actually a medical centre now, and so we can't go in there. But we can come in Latham Hall, which is a wonderful tribute to the 1960s. All sorts of memorabilia is up here. And the Beatles played in Latham Hall, getting on for 20 times. They played in Litherland Town Hall about 20 times. So they were very, very regular customers here. And to discuss those days with me are two friends of mine, Dave Jamieson, who was a roadie for almost everyone, and Sam Hardy of King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. And you've met King Size Taylor in previous DVDs that Arts Magic have done. And one of the key gigs of the Beatles, in fact, if you look in Who's Who, Paul McCartney puts down as his most memorable appearance, 27th of December 1960, Litherland Town Hall. They'd just come back from Germany and they were really cooking, and Dave Jamieson was there. Dave, tell us about it.
Yeah, it was there. It was funny really, because the Litherland Town Hall was one of my regular haunts. And I remember being interviewed by Billy Butler, and he wanted to know how I got from Kirby to the Litherland Town Hall. Well, I had a car. I had a car from 1958, and that's how I became a roadie, as you said before. If you had wheels in them days, you were an automatic roadie, as Stanley will tell you, you know. And I went down to the Litherland on the 27th and walked in backstage, and I bumped into Ian Edwards. He was with the Deltones then. And as I walked round, I bumped into George and Pete, and I said, "What are you doing here?" He says, "We're on the bill." I said, "Well, you're not advertised." He said, "No." He says, we didn't have time to get advertised. And the history is that Bob Buller arranged for a booking for the Beatles with Brian Kelly, and he put them on one of his Christmas shows, which was the 27th of December. Yeah. And having previously been to Hamburg in the October before the Christmas, I had a little bit an idea of what to expect when they came on stage. Rory was with him in Germany and with the Beatles, and I think because of the constant playing, they were just two different bands, especially the Beatles. Mm-hmm. Because you had to remember that before that, they went to Germany. Alan Williams never put them on the stadium show because he didn't think they were good enough. And they always didn't have a drummer. Used to get Tommy Moore to stand in now and again. So I had some idea what to expect. Anyway, Searchers were on, the Deltones were on, and the Dalrinas. And of course, when the Beatles come on, Bob Bullard announced them straight from Hamburg, Germany, the Fabulous Beatles. Of course, the curtains opened, and these four lads stood there with leather jackets on, black t-shirts, looked like James Deans, and everyone just went for the stage, screaming, and Paul went in. There's some controversy over that. I always say it was Long Tall Sally. Some people said it wasn't, but I'm convinced it was Long Tall Sally.
Do you think that Bob Wooler was trying to pretend that this was a German band or not?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, you know Bob.
Yeah.
I mean, Bob was a dry person, and he used to do little antidotes and everything, you know. And I don't really know. It could have been spent.
But as soon as they spoke, you'd know they were from Liverpool, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah. You know, they went right into the song, come out, and the audience just went berserk. Yeah. Now, that was the start of Beatlemania.
What you said is fascinating, because you are one of the few people, maybe the only person who wasn't a musician as such, who actually saw the Beatles in Hamburg and in Liverpool in 1960.
Well, you brought that up at our last interview, and I never thought of it that way. And it was only uncanny, really, because Aden had come on, or they were having trouble in Aden, and I was in the emergency reserve, and we went over to Dusseldorf for a few days. Then we ended up in Bremen. Well, Sam will know, Bremen was on the rail line to Hamburg, so we shot down there the weekend, and we were in army uniform, and the first person I met was Fasher, Horst Fasher. I didn't know him, and he just said to us, a nice way, if we had civvies, put them on, you know. And we got changed in civvies, and I seen Pete Best, George, Paul, and Lennon come up. Well, Lennon always called me Jammy. If I was with a crowd of people, he always said, "Hiya, Jammy," in a real prerogative way, you know. And the first thing he said to us, because it was Saturday the 5th of November, and he said, "Did you bring any bangers?" You know, typical Lennon quirk, you know. I said, "No." Ringo, we didn't see Ringo to talk to because he was knocking around with Goldie then. And seen Rory and Ty and everything. And then we seen the show again, and I just couldn't get over the way the two bands had changed. And as most people said at the Litherland, the most significant thing was the double pedal on the bass. The double pedaling, because people weren't doing it.
Yeah.
Sam can tell you that.
Yeah, so Pete Best was really crucial to the band.
And Ringo, you know, I mean, and I always remember talking to Pete Best, and he always said they had to do it because you couldn't be heard with the crowd, you know, because, I mean, I don't think there was a venue that took as many as the Kaiser Keller. I mean, did the Kaiser Keller hold?
It's a big place.
You know, because I don't think there was a venue in Liverpool that took anything other than the stadium, you know.
Yeah. And Sam, when did you first come across the Beatles?
Well, quite a bit later than Dave's talking about, because I was in the original Dominoes in 1957, but in late 58 I went into the police force. I was in the police force for nearly 2 years. When I came back out again, I rejoined the Dominoes, and we were going to a gig in our van, and Cliff Roberts, the drummer, said, "We'd better be good tonight, because we're on with the Beatles." And I'd never heard of the Beatles. I thought there was some sort of an insect or something. What do you mean? What does that mean? And he said they're a band that I'm sure he said they were from Hamburg or something like that. But he said we need to be at our best tonight because we're on with the Beatles. So I was just sort of apprehensive about what we were up against. There was always gentle rivalry, well, more than gentle rivalry. There was always rivalry between the bands.
When you got to the gig, what happened? Did you think there was something to be apprehensive about?
There was always something different, and I suppose I perceived that the first time I saw them. You just couldn't ignore them. They were there on the stage, and you looked at all of them, and they were all, well, Paul and John more so really, I suppose. But you just couldn't ignore them. I mean, a lot of the bands sounded quite similar, but they had sort of, the only other band I can think of vaguely like them, Dave's talking about the bass drum, and that was the Big Three. I would say they were quite similar in some ways, the way they attacked the music.
And would I be right, Dave, in saying that most of the bookings that were at Latham Hall and at Litherland Town Hall would be for this promoter, Brian Kelly? And if so, can you tell us something about him?
One of the funny stories I had was I went to Brian Kelly's house over this tribute had done to Brian Kelly on the last show at Litherland Town Hall. Knocked on the door and his son come out, and I said, "Are you Brian's lad?" And as quick as a flash he says to me, "Yeah, I am, but there's a rumour that George Harrison used to babysit." And I just cracked up when he looked. He says, "Oh, it's one of my favourite jokes," that he said, you know, because they used to always go back to Brian's.
Yeah.
And Brian was, to be honest, he done an awful lot for rock and roll in Liverpool, didn't he?
Yeah. But Brian Kelly was special in a way because he also had a sound equipment shop, or did in later years, didn't he?
He did.
So he knew that he wanted the groups to sound right.
Well, he hired them a lot of the PAs, didn't he?
Right.
You know, he really made a business out of it, you know. But he was a very insignificant fella. He'd just stand there with his tie, and he always looked older than he did, and he always had a woodbine, and he'd be smoking all the time. And he was very quiet. Yeah.
And what are your memories of the four Beatles? Let's take them in turn. John Lennon. You must have a good John Lennon story.
I liked John Lennon. I did. A lot of people didn't. He was always all right with me. John Lennon, to me, was the ultimate rock and roller from Liverpool. He had I always thought he had a good rock voice. A lot of people said he didn't. I mean, funny story is I haven't really got one, you know. He was just as straight as a die. George Harrison, I first met George when he was about 13 or 14, and that was in Stormsville, Rory's house. I remember going there, I was 16, George must have been about 13 or 14, coming up to 14, and he was sitting there playing a little acoustic guitar, and from what I can gather, he was very, very friendly with Iris, and
that's Rory's sister.
yeah, and she told me once that, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Iris, that he was a blind date when they were about 11 or 12 at the ice ring to her friend. Her friend was courting a mate, and it must have been a mate of George's. And then George started coming to Marstones, and he always wanted to join Rory, you know. Marstone wouldn't let him because he was too young. And then Rory started the morgue off in the nursing home, nurses' residential home, in the cellar. And George used to help out on the door. And Paul, I don't know. Paul, he'd always let on and everything, but Paul to me seemed to always be like the middle class one. You know, Pete Best. I mean, you can't. I don't think there's anything ever wrong with Pete Best. I think Pete Best is a fabulous human being.
But you can't knock someone for being middle class, can you? Or
No, don't get me wrong, no. But he came over that way, you know what I mean?
But do you think he was always the PR guy, always knowing how to present himself?
Well, I think out of all of them, I think you may be right. I think he could come round and turn somebody round with his charm and everything. John would just be a typical Scouser, and you take it or leave it.
Yes.
You know.
Yes, that's the impression I get of them, really.
You know.
Do you feel the same way, Sam?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I never had an awful lot to do with them except in the Star Club. The last 2 weeks they played in Germany, I was on the same bill with them, you know. So I saw quite a lot of them then, and I saw them the previous time they played in Hamburg.
So this is just after they'd had Love Me Do out, isn't it?
Yeah, they had a copy of that with them.
Yeah. And did they feel they were going places then?
They couldn't wait, could they?
Yeah, but did they feel it was going to happen for them? Were they excited? Do you think?
The impression I got is that they couldn't wait for that job to finish so they could get back to England and get on with the success story.
Oh, I see what you mean, that they've been committed to this gig at the start.
Yeah, they had this contract.
Yes.
They probably wouldn't have done it if they'd known earlier. But Love Me Do was out. December 62, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The last job they did there.
And when do you remember them performing their own songs? Did they do that early on or not?
No, I don't remember many of them at all. Just one. They did Please Please Me, I think, in December 62.
Yeah.
And they did Love Me Do. But mainly they're still doing their ordinary songs. And they used to do a lot of standards too, didn't they?
Yeah.
You know, the jazzy things and all that. But I mean, there are some obvious things that they picked up. I mean, the way John Lennon stood was Tony Sheridan.
Tony Sheridan.
The way he stood?
Yes.
That was Tony Sheridan.
Yeah.
It was just like a mirror image of him. Yeah. And lots of other things like that, you know.
He stood like that on the Eddie Cochran show. Tony Sheridan.
Yeah, it was a very distinctive stance, isn't it?
Yeah. But he was a distinctive guitarist and all, you know. I mean, you know, he's... But I do always remember him saying that they were there to learn, and it might have been like you said before. Do you think they knew that there was something? But there's no doubt about it that Hamburg made them a much better band.
Now, Sam, you were saying you played the Tower Ballroom, New Brighton, which sadly burnt down. So it's not a site that we can. Well, we can visit the site, but we can't actually see the Tower Ballroom anymore. That was an enormous place to play, wasn't it? It was quite a prestige gig.
I think it was about 3,000 people or something like that. It was an enormous place. It's quite daunting. Some of those big shows that Sam Leach put on, he had
cracking shows.
They were great shows. But the place would be packed, absolutely solid. You had to sort of fight your way through to get to the stage sometimes. really.
Isn't it amazing, though, that at the Tower Ballroom they were getting these huge attendances for bills that were mostly just Merseybeat performers who hadn't had hit records?
It is. It certainly is. I mean, they had special bus services laid on, didn't they, to get people
Well,
home?
yeah, I mean, I absolutely love that. On the little posters for the show at the Cavern or the Tower Ballroom, everything, the way Bob Wooler and the others meticulously put down the bus routes. I mean, you'd never see that on a poster now, and it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
You see, but and then eventually what happened, the girls started to follow the bands. And as the girls followed the bands, the lads followed the girls.
Yeah.
And it became one great big happy family in Liverpool.
Yeah.
And that's something that Liverpool had, that no other city had.
Yeah. You describe things as one big happy family, but there was a night here where it wasn't one big happy family, where Stuart Sutcliffe got beaten up, and it could be that beating up actually led to his death. What do you know about that?
Well, I don't know anything about it. All I know is that the next day I'd heard that he'd had a kicking. But watching the film Backbeat within the last few weeks, it shows you Stuart on the stage here and he's throwing kisses to a girl with her usual boys round her. And of course they took offence to it, according to the film, and met him outside and gave him a kicking. And in the film it shows you John Lennon come out and helping him, you know. But that night John Lennon did break his finger, but I thought it was in the toilet, because he had a bit of a fight in the toilet and he broke his finger. This was, you could come here and if you went from this area or anything, it was quite easy to get into trouble.
Yeah. Did you think it was a tough area around here, Sam?
It wasn't the area so much, it was this place. It was a rough house sometimes. Our drummer Cliff Roberts one night, I remember leaving with him, carrying his drum kit, trying to get out from a fight, and there was a cloakroom here at the back, and it was upstairs. And as we were going out the front door, some bloke came flying through that window. Came flying out the cloakroom on the first floor, landed on the grass at the bottom. Terrible. It was quite rough. It wasn't like that every week.
No.
But there was trouble here.
Yeah. But you used to get the Norwegian sailors come in as well, didn't you?
From the Caradoc?
Yeah. You come in.
Yeah, the Caradoc down the road, yeah.
You know, piles of money.
Yeah.
Being seamen.
But
After
people,
all the women, next minute, it'd just go, you know. I mean,
well, people were prepared for it. I mean, in our band, we had legs on the amplifiers, which if trouble started, they'd be unscrewed, and you'd have a weapon.
But you also had King-size Taylor. There'd be no trouble with him around, surely.
No.
Well, someone would be daft to start a fight with him.
It would.
No.
It was. I did.
Oh, you did.
There was one at the Litherland, the Litherland Town Hall. As the Sparrow Hall mob kicked off, the Beatles were on. That was the night. Was that the night Bob Wooler announced the fabulous Beatles from Hamburg, Germany, the fabulous Beatles? And then when Ted went on, Bob Wooler said, straight from the bar in the Black Bull, the fabulous Dominoes with the swinging Scylla.
Yeah, I remember him
And it
saying
kicked
that.
off with I think it was that night, with Sparrow Hall, and Ted was on stage, and they were throwing chairs on stage, but Ted just picked up 2 chairs and threw them down the hall, and he picked up one bloke and took him right down the end of the hall. Then he jumped off and knocked the hell out of 2 of them. Ted, you know.
He's a hard lad.
Yeah. And so we're here in Latham Hall now. They've made a fabulous job of it, haven't they?
It's quite
Yes,
excellent, really. Yeah.
it's,
And this is
you
the
know.
actual stage we're sitting on.
Really?
Yes,
Oh, right.
this is it here.
The thing about it is...
So I'm standing where John Lennon might have stood.
Yeah.
You are. Yeah.
Great. Well, that's a good note to end this interview on. So Dave Jameson, Sam Hardy, it's been great to talk to you. We've been talking about Stuart Sutcliffe, amongst other things, and we're now going to go into Liverpool, and we're going to meet someone who was actually the model at the College of Art for Stuart Sutcliffe and for John Lennon, June Furlong, and I'm sure she's got a remarkable tale to tell. There are hundreds of books that have been written about the Beatles, but few are as fascinating and as different as June, a Life Study, written by June Furlong, who was the model at the Liverpool College of Art at the time of John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe. There's a lot more in the book than just the story of the Beatles, but of course we're interested in the story of the Beatles today. That's what we're talking about, and we're going to talk to June now about the College of Art in those times, in the late 1950s. And first of all, June, how did you come to be there?
Well, I've been there since I was 17 years of age. When I left school, I used to work in an advertising agency in North John Street. Well, I mean, very shortly after that, I did the night classes. But then when I was 21, I went to London for 8 years. And then when I came back, special request from the Liverpool Art College, the arrival of John Lennon. See, late 50s. So you couldn't help but get involved with him, even if you didn't want to, because he used to come in every day, all cross-questioning me about all the famous artists I knew. He knew about things with John Lennon, he knew about artists, and wanted to know about all these people who are now about the 10% of really big time artist who I knew it way back in that time, and John Lennon knew about those.
So it's often said that John Lennon did very little work at the College of Art, but he was actually interested in art.
Oh yeah, well he used to, well everybody came into the big life room, and all his group, I mean, if you were a student then, it was the academic days, you know, you had to draw. Art education's changed completely now, but in those days you had to draw. It was the ABC, it was the game, it was the man from the bank. You couldn't pass your exams if you didn't. So of course John Lennon knew that was part of his course, but he'd come in and he was always interested in all these people playing at the theatres and trying to get his group going to see these stars, special stars he liked. On a Monday night, the pavilion was going then in Smithdown Road. I'd come in and they'd all say to him, "Shut up, sit down, get on with your drawing," you see. But he'd come and go and come in again. He did make an attempt at his drawing.
Yeah. Did you see any of his drawings of you?
Not particularly many, no. No.
And what about Stuart Sutcliffe?
Oh, Stuart Sutcliffe was very different. Stuart Sutcliffe was a very good draftsman. I'm very, very interested, big time, in his art. John Lennon, yes, John Lennon was, I'm not saying he wasn't interested, but he also had this musical streak. You know what I mean? Yes. He really did. He was still performing then, even when he became a student, you see.
Are you saying that a lot of these conversations were actually when you were posing as a model, you'd chat to the students, or would they be later?
No, before. And also John Lennon would be sitting outside the crack, and I'd be walking by, "Listen to this," he'd call you over, "Listen to this, and I've just written this," and then he'd come here to this very house, and some of my family are alive at that time, and, "Oh, well, there's been a lad here, John Lennon," he said, "a very nice fellow, very nicely mannered, he wants to go to a party. I think his name's Lennon, he's left a letter or something." But I couldn't do all these things that John Lennon wanted because my hours belonged to the art college. I was the professional under contract to the art college. So all the time when the art college was open, every day and 3 nights a week till 9 o'clock at the night, I had to be there. So he'd see me in the street, in the corridor, in my rest, and he'd come in and he'd talk, you know. And then at coffee breaks, of course, I remember John Lennon saying to me, "Just going next door to see Paul, I'll be right back." And he'd go and have a coffee with McCartney. Whether he'd come back or not, I can't remember, because he was just one of many, you know what I mean, in his group at that time. But I remember, I never had a cross word with John Lennon. He was very, very nice. But he knew that I knew everybody. And of course, I was the big famous model. He was the Liverpudlian smelling of fish and chips. Scallops and chips, as Cynthia used to say, in those days. I mean, all these things like Alan Williams, the man who gave the Beatles away. John Lennon quoted as saying, the man who couldn't give the Beatles away. Nobody wanted to know about them then, you know. And the funniest thing about John Lennon, he used to like Monday night. Oh, a certain star was at the Empire, or a certain star was at the Pavilion, and he wanted all his group to go. And they'd be saying, "Yeah, be quiet, try to get your drawing right. We've got no money to go to these theatres. But always, they'd all go with him. You never refused anything John Lennon requested. Most of them, or half of them, would go with him. And the next day he'd be coming in doing these impersonations of these stars he'd seen. I couldn't go because I had to be there till 9 o'clock. And he'd come in, Rob Wilson's on the pavilion and all that. And he'd be coming in next day, and the day war broke out. He'd doing a complete impersonation of this Rob Wilson. I used to think it was a scream, all this. It really amused me. I mean, he was really quite entertaining. He was born entertainer, was John Lennon. You couldn't dislike him. I never had a crossword with him. Never, ever had any crosswords with him. I lent him a lot of fancy dress for a big play he'd written, Cinderella. He was one of the ugly sisters. He came here to my house, borrowed all the stuff. He returned every bit of this stuff. And
was it a success?
It was a big success, But he had this lady called June Harry, who I think was Cinderella. I don't know what she was in it, but it was so funny. She got rip-roaring drunk behind the scenes and said, with this, I'm going home. Nearly stopped the traffic in Catherine Street. It was just hilariously funny, that thing. John Lennon soldiered on with his part, and he said to me, I'm going to get this fellow, John Chase, who was a very handsome fellow. He's doing dress design. I know graphic design. John Chase was a very handsome sort of fellow. And John Chase said, I wouldn't be any good in this pantomime. No, I'm not going in any pantomime. But being John Lennon, his power of persuasion was pretty positive. And when the opening night comes, John Lennon said to me, I'm going to hire a special outfit for him, And John Chase, even to that moment, had said he wasn't going in this pantomime. Well, comes opening night, there's this John Chase, word perfect, dressed up in this beautiful silk green suit that John Lennon had got him. And he said to me, John Lennon, always remember that. He says, John Chase is going to be Prince Charming. And he said to me, it's the only straight part in it. I thought it was hilariously funny. And this pantomime with June Harry, who went home in the middle of it, got on a bus in this enormous big pink satin night dress, and he had the street up, and he kept letting the bus going home. But he was always full of these things, John Lennon. He was very, very, very funny. And then one day he came in, and I'll never forget this, it was after lunch, and I was getting ready for the after lunchtime session, which started, I think, 1:45, dead on time, those sessions, in those days. And he came in, so it was probably a bit before that. It was before the class started, because you've got the teacher there as well, and you couldn't be just listening to John Lennon all the time, even though I thought he was hilariously funny. But before that happened, he came in one day and he said to me, this fellow in Whitechapel, he said, he wants to manage us. And I said and he told me this story. And this was Epstein, you see, from NEMS. And John Lennon said, went on about this Epstein. So I said, well, you can handle it, can't you? He said, well, yeah, I think I can. And so I said, well, what have you got to lose? Manage you? And he cracked up laughing. He said, yes, that's right. What have we got to lose? Not a lot. I mean, they've been playing about 4 hours, enough money for beans on toast between the four of them, and they'd finished and all that. So, of course, next day, John Lennon went down. He says to Epstein, where's the contract? I'll sign it. So he did. And then he came back. And sort of signed that contract down there, I think they were playing these lunchtime sessions, and Epstein was absolutely besotted with John Lennon as the performer and all this sort of thing. And then, of course, the rest is history. And then when he came back to Liverpool, all the group from the Art College, well, they were waiting in the Crack. I said, he won't come to the Crack, he can't come to he'd be in the Crack, they said, because they all drank in the Crack. Well, he didn't. He went straight to the town hall with the Lord Mayor or something, nicely dressed in those suits and the haircut. He was no longer a private person anymore. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that was the famous Beatles, you see.
Yeah. Well,
that's how it all started.
Yeah. There's that lovely plaque that they put up in the Crack now, haven't they, with Bill Harris, Stuart Sutcliffe and John Lennon on. And they said all three of us wanted to change the world. Bill with his writing, Stuart with his painting, and John with his music.
That's right. But of course, Stuart Sutcliffe was very, very keen on his drawing. And I think John Lennon liked Stuart as a person. He admired him as an artist.
Yeah.
Although the other three said he was no musician. They didn't really
Well,
want him.
John seems to me, his paintings are more cartoons, aren't they? He did a lot of
yeah,
but he
that
could
sort of
paint. He
thing.
could paint sort of properly as well, too, couldn't he?
Well, he didn't do much of that because I think he was doing graphics.
Yes.
He wasn't doing fine art.
Yeah.
But even so, the graphics had to come, graphic design students had to come up certainly one afternoon a week. All the people doing everything had to do life drawing as well, whatever they were doing, you see. And of course, John Lennon, before he could do his specialised subject, he had to do the intermediate. And I remember he drew me for his intermediate over in Hope Street, and he was talking to me all the time about all the famous artists I knew. He knew the names, people who are very multimillionaires now. They weren't in those days, but they were on the way up. Yeah. But he knew that. I think. I mean, they did a favour really to John Lennon by throwing him out of the art college, because I think he thought, well, it's sink or swim now.
Yeah. Well, John Lennon was very friendly with one of the teachers there, Arthur Ballard, wasn't he?
Yes,
who appears in a lot of the books.
Yes.
What was Arthur Ballard like?
Oh, very nice man, Arthur Ballard. He's another one. I never had I always got on well. Well, he was one of the first people I ever knew in the art college. But he was head of the junior art school then in Gambia Terrace, Arthur Ballard. And he used to do the night classes with a chap called John Keats. Those two were the teachers in the huge big room 75 in the art college. And that's when I first met Arthur Ballard. But of course, Arthur Ballard had always been here. He was a Liverpudlian. His father was a boxing promoter. And he had always been here. After that, he was head of our wonderful foundation studies, Arthur Ballard, and a very good artist himself. But he used to take the night classes, different teachers, full-time teachers. Yeah. And also on a Saturday, all the School of Architecture used to come over from Liverpool University. And Stuart, you asked about Stuart Sutcliffe.
Yes.
Stuart Sutcliffe would come in with his big board, and he'd say to Charlie Burton, a wonderful Welsh Charlie Burton, who was a marvellous artist, Charlie Burton, from the Royal College. I knew Charlie Burton, like a little Welsh Harry Seeker he was. And he'd say to me, look at this lazy lot. I never thought I'd end my days driving people to paint. He was a wonderful artist, gold medal at the Royal College, Charles Burton. And sometimes he used to take the Saturday morning classes, and Stuart would turn up, the place would be packed out. And he'd say to Charlie Burton, can I come in and draw? And Charlie Burton would think, oh yeah, here's Stuart. He'd say, well, all right, if you can come in, Stuart, if you can find a place, okay. And of course, Stuart would always turn up. And he always wanted this special pose, always asked me to do. And of course, he was a very good draftsman and very, very keen. When he'd never see John Lennon at those Saturday morning classes, you know, he liked obviously to be in the art college, but he wasn't as dedicated to Stuart or anything.
Well, it's interesting when you look at Stuart Sutcliffe's work, because he painted in so many different styles, didn't he?
He did. Oh, yes, he did. I think he was a better draftsman than a painter. But of course, he died so early. Who was to say? I mean, he was dead by, he was 22, wasn't he? He was dead.
Yes. That must have been a great shock to you.
It was a terrible shock. Because I remember Stuart so well. And he'd always come in, always wanted to draw, and always wanted a special pose. Well, all the drawings in this great big book, £100 book that Genesis sent me on Stuart's life, the drawings in it are of me. And those drawings now belong to Pauline Sutcliffe.
Were you surprised that Stuart wanted to be a musician as well? Or do you think he was just talked into it?
I think he was just talked into it by John. John liked him as a friend. Just as mate. He admired him as an artist, he liked him as a friend, and I think he talked Stuart into being into the group, because Stuart didn't do much, he just stayed in the back there. But I think the other two, Harrison and McCartney, said, well, he's no musician, Stuart. But I mean, they got rid of Pete Best, and he was a better drummer than Ringo, wasn't he?
Well, so a lot of people say, yes. The jury
they wanted Ringo in the group.
Yes, Yeah.
And,
But did you ever actually see the group perform?
yes, I went down to that cavern. I thought, what a dump this is. And I thought, this cavern, if there's a fire broke out here, you'd never get out of here. And
Yeah.
all these cobblestones down there. I went a couple of times. But of course, John Lennon used to put on impromptu concerts. Friday afternoon was the one day we finished early, 4 o'clock. But of course, at 7 o'clock, I had to be down at the Blue Coat for the life class there. But it was the one day we finished early. So we either all played poker, of which they started playing with matchsticks. I lost the money. I lost the money. I went back the next week, beat the socks off them because I thought this is real money involved, you know. Well, we either played poker when the session ended, or else John Lennon would give you these concerts, and he'd write all these songs about all the tutors, which were hilariously funny, and he'd borrow the mic from somewhere or other. He got things, you know. I mean, I don't know where he got that mic from, but he used to give these concerts, and they were so good that the teachers used to turn up and listen to them.
Yeah.
And they're all written about certain tutors, you know, who taught at the art college.
I can tell that even now you think that he was probably one of the most spirited people you ever met.
Oh, well, I used to look at John Lennon and I used to think, where will your talent take you? There was something about him. I thought you'll either hit the bottom, mate, or the top. Well, of course, he was lucky with the management, with Epstein, besotted with him in his talent, wasn't he? I don't think he would have come to this great success with Alan Williams. They didn't get on so well with Alan Williams, did they?
No.
So I think it was Epstein who staked all, and really pushed the boat out for them, wasn't it?
Yes, no, the last time I saw you was at the opening of an exhibition of paintings by Yankel Feather.
That's right.
In Liverpool, who also had a club in Liverpool.
That's right.
And he has a painting in that exhibition that he did in the 1950s, and he threw John Lennon out of his club one day, or out of his coffee bar one day, and John Lennon got his front door key and slashed it across the painting.
That's true.
Does that, in actual fact, it's probably worth a lot of money now that John Lennon has slashed it. But
Might be. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
does that strike you as a typical John Lennon reaction?
yes, I can tell you, he's not a bloke to say no to, John Lennon. I don't know what Yankel Feather said. He was trying to play the piano, roll over Beethoven or something, and Yankel Feather thought it was terrible rendering of this music, and told him to quieten it down, to be quiet. And then John Lennon didn't want to, because Yankel Feather ran that club very well. I mean, he never had any trouble in that club, and you know what I mean. He opened that club with nothing. Yankel Feather made a lot of money out of it, because he didn't drink and he wasn't drugged up, and he kept a good club there. And of course, John Lennon coming in thinking, oh well, this wouldn't be a bad place for us to appear at, and he had his nephew playing the piano. Who certainly couldn't be, well, never mind about that. I'm sure Lennon, I don't know, was a good pianist, but he wanted to play that music and Yankel didn't like it, see?
Yes,
And,
well, he wouldn't have had much experience of playing the piano then, John Lennon.
I don't think he had much experience of playing the piano. He played the banjo, didn't he? His mother taught him how to play a banjo, and then later a guitar, and you know, and when that in the Abbey Road, is his name George Martin, that man?
The producer, yes. Yes.
Well, he got the sound. He moulded the sound of those records. I mean, they owe a lot to him in the Abbey Road studios. You know, I mean, he knocked the rough corners off them, all right. You know what I mean? I don't think all those places they played in, the acoustics was as good as some other places, you know what I mean?
Yes.
But he got the sound right.
Yes.
He did an awful lot for them, you see. And Epstein, Epstein used to live in this street, number 36, Epstein.
Oh, that's when he had the place on his own. And in fact, John and Cynthia would also have lived here, wouldn't they?
For a little bit they lived here, a little bit. But, you know, I remember he used to always talk about Auntie Mimi. And he had a good life there with Auntie Mimi. He never wanted for anything. He was always very clean and well dressed, John Lennon. He always had a few bob in his pocket. And when his group said, oh, we can't go, looking at Morecambe and Wise, I think they were second act at the Empire then, and he quite liked them. And Johnny Ray, that singer, but particularly liked, what's that, comedian, what's the hell that, Rob Wilson.
Yes.
When he was on, I'd go and see Rob Wilson. And the others used to go with him.
Yeah.
And they used to go on a Monday night.
And Johnny Ray's a very interesting choice, actually, because he was one of the first singers to have a lot of echo on his voice. And when John Lennon recorded, he loved echo on his voice.
Loved echo.
Yes.
Well, he certainly liked that guy, liked that American
Yeah,
singer.
so that's interesting. It's the same sort of thing.
But I think they did John Lennon a favour by throwing him out. I mean, he just disorganised all the organisation.
Yeah.
Arthur Ballard could handle him, but Nicholas Horsfield couldn't. And those art history lessons, they're way above John Lennon's head. He'd go to them, you know, and they'd get up and they'd walk out and he'd say things like, oh, well, you're a wonderful speaker, it's very interesting, but doesn't mean anything to me. And but he'd be there because his group was there, but I think he'd be more thinking about how they were going to perform, what songs they were going to sing at some terrible dive they'd be at night or something like that. And then he'd be sitting. I looked up once and there was John Lennon on this very, very high shelf. I don't know how he got up there above the sink in the life room, which I thought was extremely funny. Yes. Of course, Nicholas Horsfield wasn't very keen on that because all the others were sitting down listening, trying to do their art history. But he was on this it was a very high room, and he just climbed up there, sitting on that shelf, looking down at everybody, you see. But that was typical of him. But I think he was just a great personality, John Lennon. I mean, and he was a hard Liverpool bloke, was John Lennon. Yeah. You don't cross him well. Yeah. If you... I mean, I used to listen to all he had to say, and I used to answer everything. Millions of questions he'd throw at me about all sorts of things. But I always answered him as best as I could, and I never got on the wrong side of him. I realised that you don't cross a bloke like that. It would be to your peril. Yeah. So I never had any problems with him at all.
Right. Well, you're clearly a remarkable personality yourself, June, and that comes over in your book, which is called June by June Furlong. Yeah. And thank you very much for your insights into John Lennon and to Stuart Sutcliffe.
That's all right.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We leave June Furlong in the centre of Liverpool and travel 7 miles north of the city centre to Crosby, and that's where Billy Kinsley of the Merseyside lives. So let's go and meet the man who made Wishing and Hoping and Sorrow, a man that everybody calls Mr. Merseyside. I've known Billy Kinsley for years. He's been the bass player and one of the singers with the Merseys and the Mersey Beats and with Liverpool Express. He's written a lot of great songs over the years and been on innumerable records. And this is the first time I've actually been in his studio. And the first thing that struck me, Billy, was a lovely photograph of John Lennon there with you and Tony Crane, your partner in the Merseys, looking at him.
That's right. If you look closer again, there's the other 2 members of the Mersey Beats, because that particular night we were big Beatles fans. We did a gig at the Old Spot in Bowl Street. It was a sellout gig. And we wanted to see the band, you know. And if we'd have gone back to the dressing room, which was upstairs, we wouldn't have got a decent standing area at all. There was it wasn't seated, you know, everyone was standing. So we decided to do our gig. We were using the Beatles equipment anyway. We put our guitars at the side and stood right in the front. So that was like unbelievable that we got that photograph taken, because of all the gigs we did with the Beatles, that is the only one. That is, there's a couple more taken that night actually, but it was a friend of Brian Epstein, photographer, who took 20 or 30 photographs that night. Yeah. And thank God that's one of them.
Yeah. And were the Beatles different every time you saw them on stage?
Beatles, you never knew what they were going to do. They'd always do a song that took you totally by surprise, you know. And we were big Elvis fans. You know, from his Sundays, we did a lot of those songs because Tony Crane and Aaron Williams and the first guitarist Dave Elias, they love Scotty Moore, so they did a lot of Scotty Moore solos and all that, you know. And the repertoire of Elvis that we did was incredible. And also the Everly Brothers. We did Billy Fiore songs and things like that. But every now and again, the Beatles, you'd see them doing a song that you'd never ever seen them do before or heard them do. And that was very, very exciting for me. They took you totally by surprise. They never did the same set. And, I haven't said about the Scotty Moore stuff and everything. When we got our guitarist in, Aaron Williams, I remember George coming over to us and saying, made a great choice there. Because our first guitarist, Dave, he had to leave to take his O-levels. That's how young we were.
Yeah. And how did you get on with the Beatles? Because you'd be a couple of years younger than them, which must have made quite a difference in those days.
Yeah, quite a few years younger, actually. To be honest, they were our mentors. And I mean that, really do, because they gave us so much encouragement. They'd always have something to say at the end of the gig. Maybe we'd nick the song off them or something, and that would be a sly little remark, But
well, what's a song you nicked off them?
Ooh, quite a few, Spen.
Yeah.
Well, Some Other Guy and things like that, although the big three were doing it, I think, before the Beatles. But it became a big Beatles song, and then every Liverpool band did it. We were the first ones to nick a song off, that particular one off them. But there was also other songs like Shot of Rhythm and Blues and all that they discovered. And I remember them coming back from Germany once, and I knew they were going to do the new song by the Shirelles. And we were big Shirelles fans, and we made sure that we got them there first. It was one called "Love Is a Swinging Thing." Great song. It's not a very well known Shirelles song, actually, but it's a great story because when they did it in the cabin lunchtime after coming back from Hamburg, they did it, and a couple of girls shouted out, "That's a Merseybeat song!"
Fantastic. Yeah. And what about some of the big gigs you played with the Beatles? Because although the Beatles weren't terribly well known, the Tower Ballroom, New Brighton, is a very big place.
The Tower Ballroom was a massive place. It was the biggest gig on Merseyside. It was burnt down a couple of years after we did it. We did it in October '62, I think, just after Love Me Do had been released. And top of the bill was Little Richard, second to top with the Beatles. We were bottom of the bill, and obviously first on. There was 10 bands on, I think. I've got the poster around somewhere. There were 10 bands on, and we were the first on. And if anyone remembers the Tower Ballroom, there wasn't just one entrance. There was lots of entrances to it, So when we went on, there was we got announced by Bob Wooler, I think, and we saw all the girls coming in, all the fellas coming in, all the girls putting handbags and dancing around them and everything, But all the guys coming in, and we, as I say, we were big Everly Brothers fans, and we didn't think we were kids. I was 15 years old, and one of our songs was like the Everly's version of Lucille, which Little Richard, Mr. Penniman, wrote.
Which has a great bass part, doesn't it?
Great bass part, but it lent itself to the harmonies we did. Yeah, we did Lucille, you don't do your daddy's wheel. Nothing like Little Richard, But in the middle of the song, and all these people are coming in, there's plenty of room in the front, 'cause as I say, it was a massive place. There is this gentleman in the middle of a shave. He had no top on, he just had a white shirt around him. A white towel around him. And he was, as I say, in the middle of a shave, he had shaving foam everywhere, which was flying everywhere. A shaving brush in one hand and a razor in the other. And he was looking up at us lot on stage singing his song going, you bastards, you plagiarists, you're doing my effing song, man. And he was really having a go. And I was looking at this razor and all the foam flying everywhere, And what could you say to that? I just said to the lads, okay, go into Dizzy Miss Lizzie, quick. And I just walked over to Little Richard and said, sorry, Little. I couldn't think of anything else to say, I mean, I didn't know his name was Richard Penniman. I thought it was Little.
Yeah.
But that's the story of that night.
Yeah. And in Crosby, there's St Luke's Hall, which is a place, oddly enough, that the Beatles never played, but everybody else did.
Yeah, I think, we called it the Jive Five. Am I right?
Yes, it was a Jive Five.
Yeah, I think it was another one of Brian Kelly. Brian Kelly was a promoter, as you know, who first saw the Beatles when they came back after the monumental first trip to Hamburg, saw how good they'd become as a band, and locked them in a dressing room, so the tail goes and booked them for many gigs. But the Jive Five was one of them. There was one just down the road actually that Brian Kelly had as well, Alexandra Hall, which has just been knocked down for posh flats.
Yes, indeed.
Should've
And Sherry Blair sang there too.
Did she?
Yes.
I didn't know
The
that.
Beatles and Sherry Blair. There we
No.
are, yes. But the Beatles just played there once at Alexandra Hall.
Right, yeah, okay.
Yeah. They played much more in Southport. And did you play much in Southport? Kingsway, places like that?
I don't think we played the Kingsway, no. No, I know that was a big gig for lots and lots of bands, but we were a town band, really. You know, we did all the, you know, the dance halls all over, you know, the outlying districts of Liverpool. You know, like Kirby, Huyton, West Derby. Well, we were actually not too far from West Derby, but we did. Those were the gigs we did. Besides all the cavern gigs we did in Liverpool, in the centre of Liverpool, and the Iron Door, we were city walls.
Would you have been too young to have played at the Casbah?
Yeah, yeah. The Casbah story is quite intriguing for me because I know it so well now. I know Pete and Rogue best very well, you know. And in fact, I was just there with an American friend of mine the other week, and I was telling them the story about when I was at school and I was in a band at school. You know, we'd started what became the Merseyside. We would call them Mavericks. And I was a bit shy, and I was 14 years old when we started the band, and we did like about 6 months of gigs before I actually saw the Beatles. And all my mates at school would come in on a Monday and say, "Yeah, you saw the Beatles in the Casbah, saw the Big Three in the Casbah, you know, saw Rory Storm in the Casbah," and I've never seen any of these bands. We were just doing our own little thing, you know. And then when we saw the Beatles and the Big Three and everyone, that was our big influence. You know, we sort of changed our approach to music, really. We thought, these are great. All these bands are superb, you know, especially the Beatles and the Big Three.
And did you watch other people playing bass and see what they do? Because someone like Johnny Gustafson with the Big Three would be playing it differently from Paul McCartney.
Yeah, Johnny had to play a lot more because as a three-piece you had to fill in a lot more. Paul was a lot more simplified bass player. And they were the two bass players I watched with reverence. I just looked at them, and because I was a singing bass player as well, and they were the other two singing bass players around Liverpool, so I learnt a lot from them. And also Jackie Lomax was one of my heroes.
Isn't playing the bass pretty hard on your fingers?
Not really. It was hard originally because it was a flip of a coin whether I was going to be a bass player or a drummer.
Yeah.
There was 3 of us when we got together, so and the other 2 were older than me and better guitarists. But I did most of the singing. So it was like a flip of a coin. You know, you 2 are better than me, so I'll get a bass or a drum kit. That's how simple it was in those days, you know. So flip of a coin, tails, I'll get a drum kit. Heads, I'll get a bass guitar. It was heads, and the next day I went to Hessie's when it was in Manchester Street, just by the tunnel. And I saw a Burns bass guitar, which was red with a maple neck. I took it home. I'd never played it at all. I'd never played a bass in my life, bass guitar. And I learned to play it over the weekend. I learned to boogie, lots of boogies and all that, you know. And then I realised, I've got to sing as well. And in that way, I was very lucky because I'm right-handed and left-footed, so I'm a bit ambidextrous in that way, you know. Well, a lot ambidextrous. And that helped me. I really believe that did help me to become a bass player singer, because it's not the easiest job in the world.
Yeah. And of the Beatles records, which is one that really shows how good Paul is as a bass player?
As a bass player, if you have a good listen, everything except Love Me Do and things like that, the early ones, you know. But I think when they started doing all the studio stuff, you know, when Sgt. Pepper, really, every track on that. By that time, he'd started putting the bass on afterwards. They'd record the tracks. He'd probably be playing piano or guitar. And then he'd think about it, he'd have something to work on, and that's when he'd do the bass lines. Because we were actually talking about Sgt. Pepper. We went to one of those sessions. We got invited to AMI, Abbey Road. And it was one of the first songs he did. I believe it was for Abbey Road, where It's Getting Better. Yeah. And I saw Paul talking about this years and years later, talking about John, with, you know, how different they were, but how they gelled together. And Paul was singing, "It's getting better all the time." And there was John singing, "It can't get no worse." And we actually saw John writing that in his head. Yeah. You know, he was just like throwing things in. And eventually he was going, "Can't get no worse." And then we realised, I think we realised that he'd realised that's a great line.
Yeah.
You know, total opposite to McCartney, and that's why they just gel together.
Yeah.
You know.
And there is a story going way back that you were actually, they asked your opinion of A Taste of Honey, I think.
Yeah, we'd done a gig with them, or we were at a gig with them. It was either a gig in, oh my God, Runcorn, or it might have been the gig we did for Liverpool University at the Rialto Ballroom. It was one of those. I can't remember which one it was. I've got it written down somewhere. But we were actually on the same bill, and we got there early, and before we went, I think we'd just come off stage, and Paul came into our dressing room, dragged hold of me, and took me to the Beatles dressing room and said, "Go on, what did you think of? Just tell him what you thought of A Taste of Honey," which they'd done a couple of times that week in the Cavern that I'd seen him doing, and I'd asked Paul to do it, so he knew that I loved the track, you know, and it was as if they wanted someone to say, "Yeah, it's a great track." And looking back, they were probably getting tracks together for the first album, and that was one of them.
Yeah.
So I might have had a little input there.
And indeed, and it's the first Beatles Day tomorrow.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. What's your involvement in that? Do you think it's a good idea?
It should have been done years ago, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? If it was in America or Japan or anywhere else in the world, if the Beatles would have been Cockneys, it would have been held the last 30 years.
Yeah.
But Liverpool just accepts the Beatles. You know, I really do think, you know, Paul McCartney. I had someone talking about Paul the other day. He'd taken her home from a gig, I don't know where it was, and he just signed a photograph. You know, and it was a photograph taken that night.
Yeah.
You know, and it was like, I've had it locked away for 35 years. Apparently it's worth about $4,000 or something, you know. But that's what I mean. We just take them for granted. I don't think musicians do. I think Liverpool musicians know how good they were and what they did to put this city on the map. Yeah. Because let's face it, Liverpool was only known for its docks and its seafaring, days. Yeah. Wonderful city, but I mean, it wasn't known for music before the Beatles.
But isn't it a bit tacky to celebrate it with 30,000 Beatle wigs?
Yes.
So you won't be wearing a Beatle wig tomorrow?
Do I need one?
So what are you doing tomorrow in Beatles Day?
I'm doing a quiz on Radio Merseyside, apparently. And then we're doing the show tomorrow. Everyone's doing one song, apparently. Well, we're doing one anyway. Yeah. I think we're doing 8 days a week, Tony and I.
And this is at the Arena?
At the Arena tomorrow night, yeah.
Great.
Which is the 9th of July. Yeah. Is it the 9th?
Yeah.
9th of July.
And the Mersey Beats are still recording, are they?
We're still recording, yeah. In fact, a song that we did a while ago called Poor Boy from Liverpool, we just had a cover from an American band who've done it as the Beatles. Oh. And I heard a demo they'd done of it. So I can't wait to hear that. Yeah, it just sounded like John and Paul singing. Yeah. And did you go to Paul McCartney's recent gig at Anfield? No, I didn't. My daughter was getting married that day. Our daughter was getting married, or a couple of days later. Yeah. So she got married in Ibiza. But you're still very much a fan, are you? Oh, very much a fan. Yeah. I was just a big fan of the Beatles, and they were an important part of my life, and I think I'm very, very lucky to have been a kid. At 15 years of age and being involved with, that scene at that time. Brian Epstein was a wonderful man, and that was the biggest mistake we ever made, because we were the third band that he didn't actually sign us. He didn't actually sign anybody really until later on, but he had the Beatles, then the Big Three, then the Mersey Beats. And that was my biggest regret, that we didn't stay with Brian. Nevertheless, that's a wonderfully positive way to end this interview, with your great love of the Beatles still after all these years. Still, yeah. So, Billy Kinsley, thank you very much indeed. Cheers, and thanks for letting us see your studio. Thank you. This is the 10th of July 2008, and we're going to be finding out about the first Beatles Day later on. But first off is an early morning call to Lewis's department store with its famous statue, which Ken Dodd has named Dickie Lewis. The Beatles played here in the 527 Club on the 28th of November 1962, and we're going to meet another Liverpool beat musician who was there, Denny Satan.
Lewis's have very kindly agreed to let us up onto the 5th floor, which has been used as storerooms and has not been decorated, I'm glad to say, since 1960. Okay, so we're here on the 5th floor of Lewis's now. The 5th floor of Lewis's is a part of Lewis's that is not generally shown to the public. It was a storage room for many, many years, and they've taken the stuff out of it now. And when they took the stuff out, they found that a lot of the original decorations were there. They hadn't decorated it for years and years. And for example, the towels that you see were put up there in 1951, and they're in absolutely immaculate condition, and they're very much give the flavour of that time. In fact, the whole place, when you come back in here, it's like going back in the 1950s or the early 1960s. And Denny Satan, who I've got with me, you were there at that time, and it must give you a tremendous feeling of déjà vu to be back here.
Oh, it's fantastic. This, as I remember, it was the Red Rose restaurant, and when you look around now and remember the decorations and the wall, particularly the tiled wall, it's just, it takes you back years and years and years. Mm-hmm. There was a hairdresser's on this floor. I think at one time they also had a record department somewhere on this floor.
Right. And well, the hairdressers, I know that Judy Garland had her hair done here.
Really?
When she was appearing at the Empire.
Yeah.
And it said that Shirley Bassey had her hair done here, although she wasn't with the hair at the time.
Oh, the wig came.
Yes.
The wig came instead.
Yeah.
How about Lita Rosa? Was she here?
It wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, it really was a swish place, wasn't it? A very posh place.
Oh, it was the place, yeah.
Yes.
And people couldn't afford to shop here. You know, the poor people went to Blackler's instead.
Yeah.
That was what happened.
Now, the reason I've asked you along is that you were one of the people who went to the 5 to 7 club, which was here at Lewis's. And the Beatles played there 28th of November 1962.
That's right.
So tell us about that club.
Well, it was a great little club. It was for the office workers and the staff and things after work. And you used to come straight from work in your suit and collar and tie or whatever you were, office girls and everything, and come in through the escalator and go up to the 6th floor. And it was in a staff canteen that was changed into a dance hall or club for the night. And you had to be out by 7 o'clock. It finished 5 to 7, that was the idea. Yeah. And the night we came to see the Beatles, it was packed. There was about 150 to 200 people there, and it was a brilliant night. It was just after Love Me Do came out. Yeah. I think it'd been out maybe a month, 2 months, I don't know, at the time. Now,
what is intriguing about this is that today, before we came to film, we thought that everything was happening on the 5th floor. But you were pretty certain that the Beatles appeared on the 6th floor.
That's right.
And we've been up to the 6th floor and had a look, which is a storage area now. Yeah. And there was the dance floor.
The dance floor's there, and the stairs I went up to the final floor. Mm-hmm. And I can picture it now. Picture it there was only a very small stage, maybe 18 inches high, and it was just packed with all the club members. It was a great night.
Yeah, and so even though the Beatles were a chart name, just 150 people here, you reckon?
Yeah. I don't think many people in town knew about the 5 to 7 club, you know. Yeah.
And it was 5 to 7 as numbers, as 527, but it didn't actually mean that, did it?
It meant from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock.
Yeah. And so that's why the Beatles were able to play a gig later in the day.
Yeah, I believe it on
in
the
the
Cavern.
evening, yes, so on the Cavern later in the evening.
Night,
yeah. And were you playing yourself in a group at the time?
Yeah, I was in Denny Satan and the Sabres, and we played from 1959 to 66. Mm-hmm. And we followed many of the same routes. We did the Cavern lunchtimes and evenings, went to the Star Club Hamburg, made a few records. Yeah. Didn't have quite the success of the Beatles though.
Well, you did get in the charts with The Way You Look Tonight, which was a nice doo-wop record.
Yeah. One spot above the Everly Brothers for 1 week. And I love that because they were my favourite group.
But do you feel a bit sad, a bit bitter that you never had that big hit or not?
Bitter's not the word, no. I mean, you always feel a little bit, yes, it could have been better, but I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Fantastic times.
And how did you rate the Beatles vis-a-vis the other groups at the time in 1962 when you saw them?
They were probably my second favourite group. My favourite group was the Remo Four. That, to me, they were a bit more musical. But once you started factoring in the Beatles' songwriting talent, then there's no comparison, really.
Mm-hmm. And would people have been screaming here at the 5 to 7 club for? So already the screaming was starting.
Yeah, it started
for them.
then. Yeah. Well, it was happening in the Cavern anyway, before the record.
Yeah. And what about Lewis's itself? Was this a place you often came in? Was it how big a store was it here?
It was the store in Liverpool. It was the posh store. This and George Henry Lee's.
Yeah.
They were the two stores that were top of the tree. Yeah. And they had a food hall down below, which is a bit like Harrods Food Hall in London, in comparison.
Yeah. And the main meeting place in Liverpool was, of course,
Under the statue.
Under Lewis's statue.
That's right.
And the Spinners did a song, In My Liverpool Home,
That's the one.
and that's got the line in it, we meet under a statue.
Exceedingly bare.
Exceedingly bare, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's absolutely great. It's wonderful to see all this stuff and how they preserved
Atmosphere and take me back, you know.
Yeah, well, it'd be great if they recreated one of the dances in here, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
What a good idea.
Yeah. And would you be up for playing, or do you not
I don't
play
mind.
now?
I get a few. No, I'll play now. Yeah, now and again, get a few of the boys together and we can do it.
Oh, great.
Played with Ray Ennis of the Blue Jeans just recently. We had a little gig. It was good fun.
Great. Well, it's been great to see you, Denny.
And you.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Spencer.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Cheers. And now we're going to go over to the records office now. Today, actually, the 10th of July, is the first Beatles Day in Liverpool. And the reason they've chosen the 10th of July for the first Beatles Day is because the 10th of July 1964 was the date of the Beatles' Civic reception, and we're going to see the official files on them. We leave Lewis's now and walk across to the records office, and there I'm going to meet up with an old friend, Joey Ankerer from The Chance, who were part of the Merseybeat explosion in the early 1960s. We're here in Liverpool Central Library now, and the records office is part of the Central Libraries. And we've asked them to look at a few records for Joey and to show you a few things as well about the Beatles. Now, Joey was a member of The Chance. They did very well with records like I Could Write a Book, and you were actually backed by the Beatles at some stage, weren't you?
Yeah, we were. We were backed by the Beatles in '62.
Yeah. Is that because you didn't have a backing band yourself?
Well, we were a vocal group. The reason why we were a vocal group was we didn't have any instruments to play. We had no knowledge of instruments. I could play a few notes on the piano because my dad was a pianist, a musician. And we were influenced by American music, American vocal groups, i.e. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers and things like that.
Now, when the Beatles had their Civic reception in 1964 in Liverpool, 10th of July 1964, they had it at the Town Hall, and then they had the showing of the film, the Northern premiere of the film A Hard Day's Night. And the only other act to be invited to be on the guest list, or at least I believe this to be so, at the Town Hall was in fact The Chance.
True, and I think it may have been because one of our biggest fans at the time was an MP called Bessie Braddock, and obviously she had some influence on that, I think. But what a fantastic day that was. Right. You know, we were taken downtown, picked up with a black limousine, taken downtown. The windows were, no, they weren't blacked out. The windows were not blacked out. But there were people actually collapsing as we were passing them in the street. It was like Liverpool had won the cup, and it was like just absolutely mad, absolutely crazy. It was great.
Well, the Lord Mayor's files for the Civic reception have ended up here at the records office.
Hooray!
Yes. So, and let's see what they found out about you. So let's go over and meet Kevin Roach.
My police record.
Yeah.
I don't have one. It's okay.
Hello, John. And let's
nice
find out what you've got there, because I know you're the one who actually found, amongst piles and piles of papers, the Lord Mayor's file on the Civic reception in '64.
Well, that's right. How it come about was I knew the Beatles had the Civic reception in July 1964, and I thought we must have a record of them somewhere. So I started to look through in my own time during lunch hours and breaks and stuff. And after searching through quite a few boxes, I come across the file of the Lord Mayor's reception. And the archive itself, it is a complete archive. It starts from the original letter which was sent to the Beatles from the Lord Mayor to Brian Epstein, inviting the Beatles to a Civic reception. And then it's Brian Epstein's correspondence with the Lord Mayor leading up to the date. The actual event was put forward in February 1964. Yeah. And it was from February 1964 leading up to July the 10th, 1964. And that's what we've got all the archive for.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to read through that, and there's about 500 pieces of correspondence there. And anyone can do that, though, can't they?
It is. It's well detailed, as you've said, you've read through it yourself. It is well detailed. Anyone who's interested in Beatles history or Beatles memorabilia, it is worth coming in to have a look through.
Yeah, and you see Brian Epstein's skill as a manager, because he's offered this Civic reception and he says, let's tie it in with the premiere of the film A Hard Day's Night.
Well,
Brilliant.
whether that was planned from the outset or whether that was just a happy coincidence when they'd completed their filming of the Hard Day's Night in, I think it was March, June, I think that might have just been a coincidence, but Brian...
No, I got the impression that he jumped on it and said, this is a thing to do. He knew what he was doing. Right, well, let's see a couple of bits from the file anyway.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll explain to what this is to Joe, so Joe knows what we're talking about. This is copies of the Merseyside. The Merseyside was a magazine that was produced in Liverpool. It covers the Merseyside scene. It's got an article here about the chance being signed with Pi. So if you look down here, there's your groups, there's the chance to be signed with Pi.
That's
and
right.
Your first record was I Don't Care, wasn't it?
I Don't Care, and
I Don't Care.
It was written by Eddie Amu,
Who went on to the real thing.
who later on joined the real thing,
There's articles leading up to this point where you sign with Pi, where the group is called The Shades. But you had to change that because of American band. Is that right?
Yeah, originally we were called The Shades, and there was a band in England actually, and there was another band in America. But the band in England had a particularly bad name or something, and we were advised to find another name to save complications.
It does mention about it being called The Shades, and then you have to change it. But they linked it to the American band, not the English band.
I'll tell you one thing you won't find in the Merseybeat, a report of the Beatles' Civic reception in 1964, because Bill Harry didn't get an invitation initially. He managed to get one right at the end, and he was so annoyed about it that he didn't put anything in about it.
Well, you can chart the history of the chance through the Merseybeat.
So someone can come into the library and just read through all these wonderful old Merseybeats.
Yeah.
When you say
you kept on microfilm, because you can see the condition. This is an original one that we've got in the strong room, and there's further on there as well.
Yeah, there is.
But it was with this deal with Pi that is what led you on to getting the invitation to the Lord Mayor's reception for the Beatles. We've got the original letter here.
All right.
Who sent
which
it?
was from Ted Ross.
Oh, right, from Ted, yeah.
And what happened was, the Lord Mayor was influenced by Bessie Braddock to invite the chance to the Lord Mayor's reception.
As you thought.
And as Spencer's already said, he was the only group that appeared at the Lord Mayor's reception. No other Merseybeat group was invited.
That's true, yes. That's true.
Well, if you look down here, there's an interesting note on this from the Lord Mayor. He said he's inviting people who's connected with the Beatles and who influenced the Beatles.
That's
so
true.
the Lord Mayor's claimed that you've influenced the Beatles.
To a certain extent, there was some influence there.
And there's if you look there, there's Ted Ross's reply saying yes, they'd love to attend. And he also says there are 5 members of the chance and myself, which is Ted Ross who wants to attend.
Of course.
And if you look down here as well, here's the last piece of correspondence where the Lord Mayor just writes back and says, yeah, your tickets are on the way. And it gives you Ted details of what he's got to do on the day. But it was a hectic day, as you remember.
Yep, and it was a charity night as well. I mean, the file shows I think they made 5,000 for charity.
5,000.
But what's that other piece you've got out there?
What this is an official list of people who was invited to the Lord Mayor's reception. And what's interesting about this list is it gives you the name and the address of the person invited. Tells you how many tickets was allocated, and if the person wanted to go or whether they declined to go. So the D next to the name stands for declined. If you look there at the top on Tony Barrow, who was associated with the Beatles press.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I remember Tony.
He declined
to
attend the Lord Mayor's reception.
I know that because he was involved with Jerry and the Pacemakers on something else at the time.
He has given his excuses why he declined, but it was interesting to see that he just actually declined.
And there's Bessie Braddock, the MP.
There's Bessie Braddock with her address of Zigzag Road.
Now, the McCartneys are well known for attending everything that Paul's involved with, so are there a lot of McCartneys on that?
Yeah, all the McCartney family have been listed. I think Paul was the one who invited the most to the reception. I think it was his family that basically took over the reception. John Lennon only invited 3 people to the reception. And what we have in the file is a typed transcript of who's invited, who the Beatles wanted to be there.
That's right.
Like I say, Paul's is the biggest list.
Yes.
Then you've got George, Ringo, And down to Johnny's and typed out is just a handwritten piece of scrap paper saying, I want these 2 people to attend.
Yes, because Aunt Mimi was in New Zealand at the time, and I think John Lennon was a bit stuck for relations he wanted to invite, really.
Yeah, I think
but it does show you how tightly knit the McCartney family is.
Yeah.
Now, in the records office, there are all sorts of things, birth certificates, details of birth certificates, baptism records, school records and the like. And I asked you, Kev, to get out a few things that you've got on the Beatles. So shall we move down here and have a look at what you've got?
If you look through here, this is the Liverpool Institute School Register. In the Liverpool Institute, we've got a few copies. We've got one for Paul McCartney. We've also got one for George Harrison. But if you look at the school register, it gives you the admission number, obviously his admission number. Then it gives you the child's name, which is interesting, James Paul McCartney. Not Paul McCartney, as all the fans know. His date of birth, his address, and as you can see there's 2 addresses because he lived at Ardwick Road and then he moved to Portland Road, which is the most famous address, which the National Trust have done it. Further along the column, it gives you the name of the parents. The last school attended, which was Joseph Williamson School. The date that he'd left the institute, which was the 21st of July 1960, and the reason for leaving the institute. Someone in the school...
And they put working in Hamburg.
Someone in the school has written, reason for leaving the school, working in Hamburg, one of the Beatles.
Yes.
So
fantastic.
Even at that time, the Beatles was...
Oh, they were very,
they
were very well known in Liverpool.
Yeah.
They were the most prominent group. You
Well,
know.
as you guys got down there, which is very unusual to say working in Hamburg as one of the Beatles.
Indeed, it's lovely to have that on the official record. Okay, let's have a look at the next pieces you've got here.
What we have here, during the Liverpool Institute, Paul, he was a model student, not like the report of John Lennon, but Paul was a model student. And here's some documents relating to Paul's school career. In 1959, at one of the Speech Day Awards, because Paul was doing so well as his artwork and his study work, they decided to give him a special prize for art. So what we have here is the invitation to the Speech Day of 1959, the programme of the Speech Day, and listed in the programme under special prizes, prize for art, J.P. McCartney, once again, James Paul McCartney.
Right.
Also as well, in his last year of school, between working in Hamburg,
Yes.
he was in a school play, which was St. John.
And that's a pretty difficult play to do, isn't it? I've just seen it in the National.
He never had a major role in the play, but this is the programme from the play itself. If you look down here, you've got the major roles, which was given out to the people, but Paul himself, he just played the role of an extra as an assessor. And if you look through the list of assessors, there's about 12 or 15 of them listed, where you can see Paul McCartney's name listed there.
Right. And here too, Peter Sissons. So that's a newscaster.
Yeah, yeah.
Fascinating. And so a lot of these things you dug out of the records office have been discovered now, but there's still stuff that people could probably dig out if they spent time, is there, that nobody knows about?
There's probably more stuff there, but people haven't got the time to go through them. But you will probably find more stuff there.
Yeah. And what's this one here?
This one, let's just check now. This is Dovedale Road.
Primary school.
Primary school,
Yep.
where John Lennon and George Harrison attended. This one is the register for John Lennon. And if you look once again, it tells you details of when he was admitted into school. Gives you his name, John Lennon, his date of birth, which was the 9th of October 1940. This is his address of 251 Menlo Avenue. His father's name, Alfred. The last school attended, or the school he went to, or the last school attended, sorry, was Mospitz Lane. And then he'd left school the 10th of July 1952 and moved on to the Quarry Bank.
Right.
And also in there is George as well.
And what does it say about George? Let's just have a quick look at George.
Well, this is a really interesting one. Not a lot of people have picked up on this. I don't think you picked up on it either, Spencer, when you were doing it.
Okay, right.
If you look along the column for George Harrison, once again, it gives all the details. But in this column, there's a small note, and at the top of the column, it says whether exempt from religious instruction. And next to George Harrison's names, it says yes. So in junior school, he was exempt from religious instruction.
Right.
But when you think about putting religion and faith was to George in later life, that's a very prominent comment for the school.
It really is.
Exempt him from religious education.
And I wonder why that was. His parents have obviously said they didn't want George to have that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, all the way through his junior school life, he never attended a religious class. And in later life, he started searching for faith.
Searching for the faith that he believed in.
But not a lot of people pick up on it.
No,
They don't
no.
notice that.
What an,
brilliant.
what an extraordinary thing to
Brilliant.
find out.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
Information,
Indeed.
yeah.
Yes, yeah. It's absolutely been terrific to see all these things. And I think the message of all this is that records offices are not imposing places. Anyone can come in and look at this material, and the staff are very friendly and there to help.
Yeah, if anybody wants to call in, just call in. If they're not too sure, just speak to the staff and we'll direct you the best way we can, advise you what you're looking for.
And there's piles of Beatles information here to be sifted out, so that's
There is,
great.
and if you've got time on your hands, you can go through it all.
Great. Well, Kev, it's been great to see you again,
Okay.
so thanks very much.
Pleasure.
And Joey, always good to see you.
Thank you,
And
Spencer.
we were looking then at the premiere of the Hard Day's Night film. We're now going to go over to the new Hard Day's Night Hotel. The Hard Day's Night Hotel opened in 2008, and we're going to have a chat with one of the city's leading journalists, David Charters from the Liverpool Daily Post.
Well.
Yeah, so this is the John Lennon suite in the Hard Day's Night Hotel. The most palatial room in the hotel, £600 a night to stay here.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you agree with me, David, but I always feel that if two people came here, one was a real Beatles fan and the other one wasn't, the Beatles fan would absolutely love this place. And the other person would actually like it too. It's a tasteful hotel, it's not a tacky hotel.
Well, what they've done is very cleverly combined a good hotel with a theme hotel, haven't they? Because I think with all theme hotels, you know, somebody isn't interested in the theme. They're clearly going to want a good meal and comfortable bed, you know, and that's what this hotel does, you know, combines two things, you know, which is a very good idea.
Yeah. And over the years, you've been writing a lot for the Liverpool Daily Post.
Oh, yes.
You must have seen a tremendous change in the city, and part of that is brought about by the Beatles.
Yeah, the Beatles in a sense have been a constant in the city, but I think the city was quite slow to get the Americanized commercial aspect of the Beatles very much into view. You know, that came perhaps surprisingly late, much later than Memphis saw Elvis's potential, I think. But in recent years, it's gained pace, that, and the momentum of the Beatles has been very important, I think, to the development of Liverpool up to this capital of culture year. And the way I think about it is that Liverpool has many great assets, which we always go on about. You know, we've got the river, the Georgian architecture, the two magnificent cathedrals. And yet, in truth, many cities have those things, though perhaps not in the same quality and quantity. So the difference Liverpool has, the difference which it can exploit for commercial gain and cultural gain, is the Beatles. No other city has a pop band which has the importance of the Beatles in local culture and in international culture.
Yes, and with two of them living who can visit the city, Paul McCartney in particular.
Paul McCartney's a great ambassador for Liverpool now, isn't he? You know, I sometimes think it amusingly of what George and John would have thought of that, because I think they were less ambassadorial in their own nature and didn't, you know, and didn't see Liverpool in quite the same way as Paul has. Paul is a local boy who's seen the advantages of playing the local ticket, I think, as well. And obviously Ringo Starr, with some controversy, admittedly, but Ringo Starr did come and open the
Yes, do you think Ringo Starr just had too much when he appeared on the Jonathan Ross show? There'd been too much Liverpool, and he said what he said. He'd appeared in Liverpool for the capital of culture. He'd done his job extremely well there. And then he goes on television and he says, oh, well, I was only making it up what I said about Liverpool.
Yeah, well, it was a typical Liverpudlian remark, that, I think, and it should have been taken in that spirit. It was, you know, you can be too sensitive about these things. And I'm hoping that one of the things will emerge in the, you know, in the new Liverpool is we'll go back to the robust way we were in the past, in which we exchanged insults, and there was a good humour about it. You know, I don't take against Ringo Starr for that. And after all, people said about the Beatles, you know, they can't sing for toffees and things like that, and things like that. I mean, they weren't always seen as the ambassadors for the city, and in fact, you know, in the biblical sense, they were almost seen as a prophet in their own city, not always welcome, I think. Paul McCartney, of course, now is a very regular visitor and has that diplomatic technique which makes him popular. He was always the PR Beatle anyway, and he's just, you know, he's developed that.
Well, he's done an extraordinary job with LIPA, hasn't he? I mean, whenever you go to the theatre now, there are people who are graduates of LIPA in the cast or technicians.
Absolutely, and you know, he's a great musician and a great person, Paul McCartney, and I do feel, although I've used some of the popularly used phrases against him, you know, the PR Beatle and so on, that it should never be allowed to undermine the huge musical contribution he made. His sense of melody is absolutely wonderful and has sustained quite well, and clearly his Beatle days were the strongest, but you know, he has sustained well. He's a great rock and roller, you know. I've great admiration for him, and I don't think it's nice for people just to see him as a kind of a kind of chummy fella, that he really is still, you know, a hard-edged Beatle, and I think that's the way to think of it, you know. George was my favourite.
Yes, and why was that?
I just feel that George had a particular, a laid-back essence about him. He had, you know, people too glibly say, oh, he was the spiritual Beatle, and, you know, the other one was the smiling Beatle or whatever, but George was a nice guy. I liked his speaking voice. I think he had a terrific vocabulary. He had a fluency in conversation, which neither Paul nor John had. I think some of his songs were greatly underrated. I mean, I think some of the lyrics in Taxman are sensationally good and witty at the time, showing a satirical touch almost worthy of Ray Davis, you know.
Well, I'll take you by surprise now, because we've been in the records office this morning, and there's George Harrison's record at Dovedale School there, and it has a column exempt from religious education, and he's got a yes in the column. Now, do you find that amazing at that young age that he didn't have to attend the school assemblies?
That's an extraordinary thing there, because I think that George, one of the problems is the popular press in this country sort of says if you're interested in religion, you're presented as a nutcase, practically, whichever faith you may tie yourself to. But I've heard George Harrison talking about his religious beliefs, and you know, one of the things he said was you could take elements, as long as you had a strong faith in a deity and a power which was unearthly and was providing for the people on earth. You could use various religious faiths to do that, and I think George is an extremely wise man, and you know, I love the reputation of George, and I love what he said, and I think his contribution is actually the greatest of the four Beatles, in a lasting sense.
Yeah, and it seems to me that 2008 has brought a real transformation in Liverpool. Tourists are just flocking into the city now, aren't they?
Yeah, it has. It's quite controversial, and you know, clearly it's been hugely commercially successful. Having the new shopping areas and so on has done a great deal. There are complaints, and I think they're quite valid complaints, that ordinary Liverpudlians haven't benefited as much from the capital of culture as they should have done, that it's been very concentric in a sense, and that the people who have benefited from it have largely been the usual suspects, the people you would expect to benefit from a cultural thing. I was talking to a man who's been organising commemoration of those young men who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War from Liverpool, and he was saying there's been an awful lot for certain people, but there's not been an awful lot for the culture of Liverpool itself, and there's still time. And I very much hope that the culture of Liverpool itself will emerge from this and will be expanded in you know, in the years to come, because you don't have to shut, you know, January, the end of December doesn't close everything off. Liverpool's got culture. It doesn't depend on a year. Yeah, I sometimes think about this and what John Lennon would have thought, because he, you know, again in the tag sense, he was the rebel Beatle. And I wonder what he would have made of the way in which the city has been presented, because, you know, the shops are fine and they appeal to a certain section of the people, but unlike the Beatles, you know, we were saying at the beginning of the conversation, Liverpool has the Beatles, that makes it unique. Everybody's got shops, but only Liverpool has the Beatles. Yes. And that is the more important point, I think.
Well, that sounds like a good subject for a feature for you.
Oh, right.
So I'll let you get back to your desk, and it's been great seeing you as always.
Yeah, nice seeing you.
Now we're going to go round the corner and see a tailor, Walter Smith, who made the Beatles suits. Hello, Walter.
Oh, hello there.
This is Walter Smith from the tailors Beano Dorm, and they made the suits for the Beatles. So I'd like to ask you, Walter, why did the Beatles go to a bespoke tailor's as opposed to buying off the peg?
Well, Brian Epstein had been a long-standing customer of ours. He regularly used to visit us on a Wednesday afternoon, of course, half-day closing in Liverpool in those days. He was having a fitting one Wednesday, and he said to me, next Wednesday, I'm bringing you 4 lads in, musicians. I'm going to manage them. So I said, oh, who are they? And he said, the Beatles. So I said, okay, look forward to seeing them. So when I was in the workshop, we had a lot of girls working there. And I said to the girls, have you ever heard of this group called the Beatles? And they said, oh, they're fab. They perform at the Cavern. And I said, they'll never get anywhere with a name like the Beatles, you know, 'cause I was thinking of the insect, of course. And anyway, the following Wednesday, he duly brought in the 4 Beatles. Of course, Bess was a member of the group at that time. It wasn't Ringo Starr. And so they wanted suits for their first television performance. And I showed them various cloths. And I always remember the price of the cloths I was showing them. It was 28 guineas, because we used to talk guineas in tailors in those days. And of course, in our money, £29.40. And Brian Epstein said, oh, it's too expensive. But it was just the cloth they wanted. It was a blue with a slub, and ideal for their performance. So I said to my boss, Ben O'Dorn, Mr. Epstein likes this cloth, but it's 28 guineas, Mr. Dorn. He said it's too expensive. But he did say that we'll get lots of business if you know, we do the work for him. And he said, well, give them a 5 guinea discount. So that made it 23 guineas. So I measured them up, and the suits had to be with a rather Italian styling, drop shoulder line, rather boxy short jackets, very slimline trousers. And we had to do it fairly quickly, because I think it was a couple of weeks to the performance. And we duly organised the fitting, because getting the trousers on were narrower and narrower. They had to be very narrow. And of course they had these winkle picker boots. Now, of course, being young men and out performing the small hours of the morning and sweating, and these boots with synthetic lining in, you can imagine taking these sort of boots off, the smell of sweaty feet. And in fact, I had to spray after they'd had a try on. And anyway, everything went well. They duly had that. And it wasn't my kind of music, really, but every Sunday I used to listen to Top 20, and this group, the Beatles, you know, the 18 one week, 13 the next, 10 the next. I thought, gosh, they're climbing up the charts. And I followed it closely, and of course they duly hit the top. Yeah. The Beatles were an extremely lively group of lads, but their language was rather choice. And I had to say to them, in fact, I still remember the words I used, could I ask you to moderate your language and remember you're in a tailor's shop? I don't think I'd do that today, but as a young man, you know, sort of trying to keep up standards, it seemed the way to be. But of course, these days, things are much more relaxed.
Yeah. And did you continue making suits for Brian Epstein?
Yes, we did. And his brother Clive, of course. Yeah. They were both good customers.
Because Brian was a most elegant man, wasn't he?
He was, yes. He was very fussy. And presumably that's why he brought the Beatles in to see us in the first place.
Well, Walter, it's been great to meet you. And what we're going to do now is take a ferry across the Mersey.
Okay, that's. I was on the ferry last week.
There's no question about it, the ferry across the Mersey is the most famous ferry in the world. And the reason it's the most famous ferry in the world is because Jerry and the Pacemakers had a top 10 single about it, and also made a film called Ferry Across the Mersey. And one of the people we're about to meet was the pianist with Jerry and the Pacemakers, Les Maguire.
There's a place called Litherland, just over the Mersey. You can get there by boat or by train. In the early morning light, with the tide running right, we go back again and again.
Well, we're here on a ferry across the Mersey on a lovely summer day, and I've got with me Hank Walters, who was known as the Hillbilly Docker, a man who really introduced country music to Merseyside, and Les Maguire from Jerry and the Pacemakers. He was a pianist in the band. And Les, I have never sat with someone before and their record has come over the tannoy. How do you feel about Ferry Across the Mersey being played all the time?
It's very nostalgic, actually. When we made the film Ferry Across the Mersey, it was on one of these boats, and that's the only time. Well, we didn't actually play it. It was actually being filmed to playback. But so I've never actually played Ferry Across the Mersey.
Yeah. And Hank, groups like the Beatles and Jerry and the Pacemakers, there's a big country music influence in their work. I mean, do you think you were responsible for some of that?
Well, I'd like to think it was. I mean, they had their own way of airing their own music, but I've got a feeling that there was definitely a little hint of country music in their style of playing.
I mean, you didn't always get on well with John Lennon, did you?
Oh no, we were never narky, like we were in the Albany Cinema in McCull, and we'd been out for chips on a Sunday on the Jim Gretty show, you know. And I'd come back and I was standing there, and I had chips, and John Lennon was standing there, and he had that on, and we used to wear the Stetson them days, you know, stupid buggers you were. Anyway, he just kept going, taking the chip off, and I kept closing the bag up a little bit, you know. But we got talking about various things, and then it cropped up what he said about, if you don't play country music, you're never going to get nowhere, said John Lennon. Never going to get anywhere. I said, and I don't like words to that effect. It's a long time ago now, and you know, not compass mentis. But John Lennon said, well, I don't like your music, but I like you that, give you that. That's stuck in my mind. On the Jim Gretty show, Ken Dobbs, the boss on the show, you know.
Yes, and the Beatles didn't do very well that night, did they?
No, they didn't. We were gloating.
Yeah.
I mean, we went out of order for gloating, but I mean, they weren't so hot, you know. But
so you were actually saying the Beatles are rubbish on that show?
They were, but I didn't know. If I would have known they were going to be at a culture day, their influence.
Yeah. And Les, you played a couple of hundred times at the Cavern, very much on a par with the Beatles, and in fact you alternated lunchtimes with them, didn't you?
Sure, yeah. The routine was that between us we covered the whole 5 days, the lunchtime sessions. 1 week we'd do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the Beatles would do Tuesday, Thursday, and then the other week it'd be the other way around.
And did you try and get some songs before the Beatles, learn them very fast?
Well, I think everybody in Liverpool, they were always down there for the new records, and it was who could get them out first. Because once you'd played at the Cavern and you'd done a new song, it kind of restricted other people, otherwise they'd be copying you. Yeah. So it was important to get the song first and get it rehearsed and performed.
Now, your first single was How Do You Do It, which went to #1.
Yeah.
Did you know when you made that record that the Beatles had turned it down?
Yeah, we did.
And didn't you think, well, there may be something wrong with this song or something?
Not really, because I think the Beatles always wanted to write their own stuff, and they always did write their own stuff. And I think How Do You Do It wasn't their type of music, really.
And did you really admire the Beatles from the word go?
Sure, yeah, they were always something special. The appearance, the sound, it was always a fantastic sound.
And they talk posh as well.
Yeah. They weren't working class heroes then, in your opinion?
Pardon?
They weren't working class heroes?
Oh, they weren't working class heroes, definitely. They weren't jockeys, that's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the jokes, isn't it, of the Beatles? The John Lennon lives in Menlove Avenue, and they say working class hero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fact.
Yeah. And what about playing on the beach ships, the Royal Iris? Because the Beatles did those, you did those, didn't you?
Yeah.
What was it like actually playing on the boat?
I never done it with the Beatles on them. They were all country on the shows that we were on. Ricky Tomlinson was the compere. He was called Obo Rick then, you know.
Yeah.
It was a bit chaotic, you know, trying to get to the bar, and the fella coming around with all of our bottles.
Yeah. And how did you find the Royal Iris?
Well, I think I first played on the Royal Iris with Bob Evans and the 5 Shillings, and later become the Undertakers. But we also did a couple of gigs with the Pacemakers as well. Can't remember too well, but I'm sure we did.
Yeah, and you did a famous gig, didn't you, at Litherland Town Hall with the Beatles?
With the Beatles,
where you called yourselves the Beatmakers.
Yeah, I can't remember much about it. I can remember we were all on stage together, all in that long line. I think we played Johnny B. Good and all the Chuck Berry stuff, because it's something we both knew. But more than that, I can't really remember a great deal about it.
Yeah. And what about when the Beatles first came back from Hamburg? Were they really different then? You hadn't been to Hamburg, so did you see something's happened, we must get over there or anything?
Well, I joined the Pacemakers after they'd been to Hamburg once. They'd been there in 1960 with Arthur McMahon playing piano. I joined the Pacemakers in 61, and we went to Germany for the first time with me in, I think it was September, October. But we used to alternate with the Beatles again. They'd come back and we'd go, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But I think at the Star Club we were actually there both together. I think Little Richard was there and Fats Domino, and they were there for 2 weeks. There was an overlap of about 2 weeks.
Yes.
We all lived in the same flat.
Yeah, and you met your girlfriend there who you were married.
That's right, Brigitte, yeah.
And I mean, Brian Epstein was very much against his Beat group members marrying, so was he against you marrying?
Oh yeah, he gave me down on pegs. Yeah, we got married in November. We went away for a tour of Sweden, and we came back, and I think we were doing the London Sunday night at the London Palladium, and I got the big finger. Come and talk to me. So he took me aside and gave me down the banks. What do you think you're doing, getting married?
But there was nothing he could do about it.
Oh no, I was married by then.
And do you think you did lose some female fans as a result of it?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah.
But it was, in those days, pop stars couldn't be married.
Yeah. And Hank, there's this famous story that Cunard Yanks brought the American records in and the beat groups learned the songs. Did you see anything of that?
Well, you used to get fellas going away to the States for usually about 10 days, and then he come back, and when he come back they were all talking, smoking cigars and saying, and big loud sighs and saying, hi there, and exchanging dollars in town, and they were called Cunard Yanks. They were, and he'd bring Hank Williams records back,
Yeah. And do you think that they did influence the groups? People did bring these records in, and people started to learn the songs?
Oh, they did, yeah.
I mean, did you see anything of that, Les?
Not really. I mean, what we used to do was get all the latest releases, the popular stuff, and actually get it rehearsed and perform it as soon as possible.
Yeah. And
I can't remember them coming from America.
Yeah.
I think it was more the late 50s that happened.
And presumably you went down to NEMS and knew Brian Epstein before he signed you up?
Yeah. We were always in NEMS,
or
Rushworth and Draper or whatever.
So Brown signed the Beatles up first and then came to you,
That's
did
right,
he?
yeah.
And did you think it was a good idea straight away?
Well, yeah, because he was going to get us better gigs. All of a sudden we were working down south, we got more money, and then all of a sudden it all happened.
And did that mean you then went fully professional? That was a big thing.
Well, initially when I joined the Pacemaker, I was semi-pro. I worked in Rushworth and Draper. And then when we went to Germany, I turned pro then.
Yeah. And Hank, you said you had a bit of antipathy towards the Beatles at first. When did you actually change your mind about them?
Later on, when I seen that there was class there, and with some of the songs that they were doing, well, not all the songs they were doing, and then Tickets to Ride and Hard Day's Night, you could hear the country influence, That's where Brian Epstein made a good mistake. He never signed us up.
Indeed, no. And Liverpool is often called
Nashville of the North.
Yes, the Nashville of the North, yes, the sort of country capital of England. Is that how you feel about it?
I do, yes, because at one particular time, I'm talking about, there's about 50 country bands in Liverpool, and a lot of them went over to rock and various other things, but they were all country orientated bands,
Yeah, and yet, if you look today at all the musicians in the city, there are still some of the old country musicians there, but there aren't young country musicians, are there?
No, there's no young ones coming up. Only one's named is Jalan Neil, and a couple of other youngsters, but it seems to be dying off of me. I've got to be honest about it. The Liverpool country culture's dying off, I think so.
Yeah. And what are you doing now, Les? Are you still playing?
I'm retired.
Yeah.
I'd still do the odd gig now and again. We're doing the Matthew Street Festival show.
That's the memory course.
Yes. And what's
I can never remember the chords.
And what's that as?
That's as the Zodiacs with Neil Lancaster.
Right. And so this is Ian Edwards' old group.
That's
Ian
right,
Edwards,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Ian passed away about, what was it, a year ago? 18 months ago.
And you still feel very nostalgic about the Jerry and the Pacemakers days, do you? I mean, the 4 CD set's been released. Have you played the whole 5 hours through?
I haven't played the whole lot, but I played all the stuff that was in America, stuff that I hadn't heard at all. And it was surprising how fast we actually played it. The adrenaline must have been rushing.
We did a whole played fast, didn't we? Then
we did about 20 songs in 20 minutes, I think.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I've heard that. It's astonishingly fast, isn't it? And just shows you weren't used to the big audiences, were you?
That's true. I think the place we recorded it in was a big open air stadium. It was like a It was a theatre type thing. It wasn't a football stadium.
So when people like the Beatles and yourselves went to America, it was a real culture shock having to play to 30,000 people all of a sudden.
Well, I don't think we played to big audiences like that. We played mainly to it was campuses and stuff like that.
Right. I went to see you on a show in August '63 with the Beatles when you were in Southport. When you started to have hit records, did you work with them very much?
We did a tour. I think it was with Roy Orbison, was it? I think it was.
Yes.
Bobby Goldsborough.
Yeah, that was earlier in the year. Yes.
Yeah.
And then there was later you did a week certainly at Southport with the Beatles. Do you remember that?
I can't remember that. I can remember
you did so many shows you can't remember.
Oh yeah, brain like a sieve.
Yeah. and what were they like, those shows? I mean, everyone's screaming throughout.
Basically, yeah, you could feel your ears tingle, so you couldn't hear what you were playing at all. And of course, in those days, amplification was terrible, and all the microphones were house systems. There was then never any echo or anything on it like that. It was just a flat microphone and a back line.
Yeah. And how did yourselves and the Beatles react to it? Did you like performing to an audience of screamers or not, or would you rather they were listening quietly? Did it annoy you?
No. I think if they screamed, that give you a real buzz and again an adrenaline rush.
Yeah.
But it's probably obviously made a lot of us deaf as well.
Yeah.
Because it did sting the ears. It was really painful.
Yeah. And what about you, Hank? You stayed in the city completely, didn't you? As a hillbilly docker, really?
Well, a country docker, you know.
Yeah.
Playing with country music. And we just stayed around the city and on the perimeter of the city.
Yeah.
Went up and we ventured out as far as Brighton and places like that, you know.
And you feel that the Beatles have done an awful lot for the heritage of the city?
Oh, they have. They have. You can't take that away from it, because wherever you go around the world, all they say to you is Liverpool, Beatles, you know, everybody says it to us.
Well, do you know the Beatles?
Do you know the Beatles?
Yes.
And of course I have to say, oh, I knew them very well. Very well.
And what do you say?
I tried to avoid the question, but I mean, obviously we lived in the same flat together for a couple of weeks in Hamburg. So,
and what was that like?
I can't really remember. I know we were pretty mucky and dirty and horrible, but it was just after Stuart had died. I can remember John, he used to do sketches of, strange sketches of Stuart coming out of a tulip and things, a bit psychedelic type things, you know, drawings.
Yeah, and so you actually saw the Beatles playing with Stuart Sutcliffe?
Oh yeah, early on, yeah, in Liverpool.
Yeah. And you could settle the myth. I mean, how good a bass player was he?
He was terrible.
Oh dear, yes, but he looked right, did he?
He looked the thing with the dark glasses, the leather,
yeah. And I mean, the thing about Jerry and the Pacemakers is that they were such a cheerful looking band, weren't they?
Happy-go-lucky people.
Yeah. And Freddie was a good drummer too.
Yeah, he was a good comedian as well. He was.
Well, it's been great to talk to you both, Hank and Les, and let's continue our ride on the ferry.
So ferry, cross the Mersey.
He's forgotten the word.
I always forget the words.
Rolling on, keep it rolling on, rolling into history.
Well, it's Beatles Day today, and Matthew Street is bound to be getting busy throughout the day. But the main event is going to be at Liverpool Arena tonight, where all manner of Liverpool celebrities are performing the Beatles songs. Here we are in Matthew Street, probably the most famous street in Liverpool, the home of the Cavern, the home of beat music. And today, 10th of July, is the first Beatles Day, the first day that they've celebrated the Beatles all day long. And we're going to find out what's happening now. They're selling Beatle wigs for charity, £5 each. I bought mine. I didn't know a Beatle had jet black hair, but here we are. I think I look more like Chris Montez in it, but there we are. Put my Beatle wig on, and let's find out what's happening. Right, okay, right, thank you. Right. This is the first Beatles Day, so it's something of a novelty. And who knows, in a few years' time, wearing a Beatles wig for Beatles Day in Liverpool may be the same as wearing a red nose for comic relief. And that's one thing we should stress about Beatles Day. This is a charity event. I found a quiet corner in the cavern now, and I've come across one of the people who's helped with the Beatles Day, and that's the owner of the cavern, or one of the owners of the cavern, Bill Heckle. But Bill, you're not wearing a Beatles wig.
No, thankfully, at 52 years of age, I've still got a healthy head of hair, so unlike you, Spencer, I don't need to resort to such a tacky...
I'm glad you feel that way, because I didn't know which of the Beatles had black hair.
Well, none of them have got black hair anymore, but... No, it's been a great day.
Yeah.
No, it's been a great day.
And you can see it as an annual thing now, can you?
Hopefully. I mean, some of the reporting has been a little bit erroneous. I mean, it's about time Liverpool had a Beatles Day. Well, Liverpool's had a Beatles Day for, well, 25 years ago they had a Beatle Day and a Beatle Weekend, and it's grown up into a Beatle Week. The difference between Beatle Week and what we've got today is Beatle Week is commercial. And this is an opportunity for the people of Liverpool to remember the Beatles and utilise Beatles Day as a vehicle for raising money for two very, very worthy causes. So all power to it, and we're right behind it.
Yeah, and I haven't seen you for a few weeks. Were you at Paul McCartney's concert at Anfield?
I did. I wouldn't miss. I've not missed any gig Paul's ever done in Liverpool since 1973. Right. So I would be there.
And how did it compare then?
I don't know. It's still a great event. He was great. There's the Sinatra syndrome looming large. His voice is beginning to go. In the 60s.
Oh, you're not already thinking, is this the last concert, surely?
I was told, reliably informed, although I didn't see it myself in the newspapers, but he actually said himself it's going to be his last tour. This is his last hurrah. Right. He's going on tour with the boys one last time, he said. So there are signs that, sadly, age catches up with everybody, that his voice is just beginning to go that little bit.
Well, I know actually when he came off stage, BBC Radio Merseyside was broadcasting it live, and then it was going to be taken by television and other media, and he thought he missed a couple of notes in Penny Lane, and he said cut Penny Lane out. Yeah. So he knew he'd done something wrong, but it was a great event. Yeah. And I mean, Bob Dylan misses all his notes, I think, these days.
And Bob Dylan couldn't sing at 20, so no, it was a fantastic. I'm a huge fan, and what he's done for the city, what the Four Lads have done for the city is just, you couldn't even begin to quantify it. We had a choir, 8-year-old choir from St Gabriel's School today, and they've been learning about the Beatles from Beatles Day, and they've been singing songs, and they came down in it. And it was just so great to see that the schools in Liverpool are embracing their own local history. Yeah, and that's what it is.
A few years ago, there weren't all that many people who were thinking the Beatles were going to live on forever. No. You being one of them, but now it's happening, and you're one of the people who's really pushed it.
Well, it's not a case, I don't think, of pushing it. It's realising sort of ahead of the game what the Beatles were. I mean, I very, very famously, as a fan, remember in 1970 when Paul sued for the dissolution of the Beatles, and I can't remember if it's NME or Melody Maker, or one of them, Sounds might have been, but one of the leaders was, it's over. We'll now see just who the Beatles were and how important the Beatles are going to be. This is in 1917. It said, if there's still interest in 3 years, they'll have bridged that all-important period of time to go into history. Oh, God, that's like, it's 38 years ago. So not only did they bridge very easily the 3 years, but it's 38 years. But again, conversely, living it as a fan, the 3 years and the 4 years are the most difficult because there was a complete reaction to what had happened in the 60s with all the bands. And I remember being only sort of 18, 20, and it was very passé to say in the early 70s, are you a Beatles fan or a McCartney fan? Yeah. But as time goes on, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger because it's a phenomenon.
Yeah, because you had groups in the 70s who didn't, from Liverpool, who didn't want to have anything to do with the Beatles. No, and now every band that comes out, you can hear the Beatles' influence.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, with whoever comes after, you know, there's always pretenders to the throne, and there has to be a reaction to what's gone before. I mean, that's what being young's about. So that organically happens with punk and the Liverpool music scene here, and you know, it's quite surprising that a lot of those 70s and 80s bands who ridiculed the Beatles in their own town, and there was bizarrely not that much love between the city and the Beatles.
And finally, what about Ringo ridiculing Liverpool on the Jonathan Ross show? Did he just make a mistake there, do you think?
For somebody that's been in the media eye for so long, he just missed an opportunity, really, a great PR opportunity for himself, his relationship with the city and for Liverpool. It was tongue-in-cheek. He was asked a simple question. He was asked, did he miss Liverpool? He was a very sickly child. He nearly died. He spent most of a whole year in hospital where he learned to play drums. He couldn't read and write. He wasn't taught in school. He was taught by a neighbour. He left school 14, 15, no qualifications, a number of dead-end jobs in a very, very poor and deprived part of Liverpool. And then he got lucky and joined what was to be the biggest band in the world. So the question was, do you miss Liverpool?
Yes.
And his memories up until he was 20, 21 would be very, very desperate and hard times. And he's waking up every morning in Monaco or Los Angeles or wherever. You know, it was a simple question and it was a simple, honest answer. Unlike a couple of days later, at somebody whose name I will not reveal, but it's fairly obvious, tells everybody in the arena of Liverpool, 10,000 people, and they're all chanting his name, and he's, you know, a great Scouser, and he said, that's why I will always remain in Liverpool. Yeah. And yet he'd actually sold up and gone to Spain 6 months before. And he got lauded by everybody for being that true Scouser. So I think it's much ado about nothing. What Ringo has achieved for this city as part of that group is phenomenal. And I think I remember saying on Radio Merseyside, a knee-jerk reaction, which I thought might have been my Gerald Ratner moment. I recoiled and said, this city has got to learn to grow up. And if anybody is seen to knock the city, we don't have to be that parochial anymore, where we get very defensive between ourselves because, you know, there was nothing really going for the city at one stage. It's such a vibrant, wonderful, bludgeoning city at the moment. We should be proud of it, embrace it. If anybody criticises it, well, let Liverpool talk for itself. When we do that, that's when we'll have really become a
and he does live in Monte Carlo after all.
And he does,
yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, Bill, it's been great to talk to you. You and Dave Jones have had the Cavern longer than anybody else in history, and long may it continue. Do you enjoy planning the programmes for the future?
I do. I mean, as I've intimated in that interview, I've been a fan since I was that high, and really get a kick out and enjoy seeing people enjoy themselves. I mean, in all this time, apart from that wig, everything's been great.
Okay. Well, I feel really daft asking questions in this wig, so I think we'll cut this interview short. So, Bill Heckle, thanks very much indeed. And let's get out onto Matthew Street again in the wig. So we're going to leave the Cavern Quarter now, but there's a whole range of events this evening to celebrate Beatles Day, and there's also going to be a mammoth concert in the Echo Arena, which is compared by Ricky Tomlinson, who probably wears a mop top far better than I do. I'm going to take my mop top off now because we're going to head to a studio and see a painter who specialises in the Beatles. Creativity in Liverpool has been blossoming in the last year or two, and never more so than at the extraordinary 100 Heads exhibition by Tony Brown at St George's Hall. Few artists have come up with completely novel ways of painting a portrait, but Tony Brown has. Here we are in Tony Brown's studio, and here's Tony Brown working on a painting at the moment. You're not actually painting as such now, are you? But you're doing a collage, I can see, and I can see that it's actually George Harrison.
It is. This is the foundation of the George portrait, which will complete the 4.
Right. And how do you go about this? Do you know where the head is exactly going to be? Have you sketched that out?
I have a rough idea. I've got an image in mind. So you kind of paste the material with a vague image in mind. But the wonderful thing about them is that there's so many snippets of information that happy accidents happen all the time.
What's an example of that?
Well, an example of that would be on the John portrait, where when I originally pasted up the work, just the line, imagine all the people.
Yes.
Which just became so vivid.
And it's like it's printed on his forehead, isn't it?
Yes.
Fantastic. And so with the George one here, you've had hundreds and hundreds of pieces to choose from, and you've chosen what really tells his story. And the face changes so much too, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And that was also the hard thing of if you're going to portray the Beatles, what period of time do you portray them? Time is not great to any of us, but obviously when we worked on the John one, John's clock had stopped at I mean, that photo is kind of 36, 40. With George, he was a relatively young man when he died. Ringo and Paul are different. They're now into their 60s. Do I paint them as a 60-year-old man, or do I paint them as a 40-year-old man? So we're going for a kind of iconic image for all of them. George, I'm looking forward to George. I find George a very iconic person anyway. Certainly with the hair, the beard. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, a very, very striking face, isn't it? The eyes, yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you've done John, you've done Paul, you've done Ringo. They're completed.
They're completed.
Yeah. Now, what gave you the idea for this in the first place? I mean, you've done 100 heads, so you've done 100 Liverpool personalities. But I've got a feeling it started with John Lennon.
It did. It started with John. John was before I'd even geared up to do the 100 heads. John was the reason I did the 100 heads. I think his portrait kind of showed me what was possible with people's lives. The fact that you could contain so much information in one image. And I thought, well, the Beatles were a massive influence on me as a child and growing up, still are. So I felt that I needed something to show that the Lennon one came from that.
I mean, you don't need me to say how great they are, because everybody's saying
everybody's
saying how great they are.
Thank you.
What I think is very good is that when you look at them from a distance, you see the face.
Yeah.
And then when you look at them close to, you go close to it, you see the life. And that's a brilliant idea you've had.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If we were to contain our life rather than have it in plastic bags and boxes stored all around the house, to have one flat image with all of your special moments, all of your friends, all of your family, all of your inspiration contained in one. It's a wonderful thing to watch people looking at them, because strangers will come up and they'll spend hours because you'll find snippets of information in them. Yeah. And I'm proud of them.
Yes, I mean, when I went to one of the exhibitions in Liverpool last year, I mean, people were spending 10 minutes or so by a picture. You could see it and reading it all. And that's fantastic in an art gallery.
And they're not even connected to the subject. It's just that they would find, well, sometimes they are obviously, but sometimes they will find so much out of reading about yourself, Roger McGough, there's various people who are recognisable. But the wonderful thing is, when you see a portrait of someone you don't know, and you start to look, and you guess, well, that may be the mother, that may be the father, that's the son, the daughter, and then you read the script at the side, which accompanies his portrait. It's like having a conversation with that person. Yeah. You may not meet them again, but it's like meeting someone on a train. You leave knowing a lot more about that person's life. And hopefully that's what will happen with the Beatles portrait. Beatles are a fantastic influence across the world, but just the fact that my young 13-year-old now has just discovered the joys of the Beatles. She loves them. So for someone like her to come along and see George when he was a young boy, George when he was older, the first album, the Beatles, Merseyside, it's a wonderful way of presenting information. Yeah.
Now you do straight portraits as well.
I do.
And there's one in here of Brian Epstein. Can you tell us about that?
Brian Epstein, I think, should have been greatly honoured by the city. Because as much as I love the Beatles, I don't think they would have got on the world stage without him and his work. Unfortunately, there's not a monument to him in the city yet. I think there will be. But a while ago, a mutual friend of ours, Joe Flannery, had asked me if I would consider doing something for the Neptune Theatre, which was to be named the Brian Epstein Theatre. And so I figured, well, the best thing to do would be an image of Brian. So I rooted through the photos, of which there's not many, and found a suitable reference stack and painted his portrait. So it went to the Neptune, it was there for a while, and now the Neptune is closed, it's back with us.
Yeah. And you're working a straight portrait of Ken Dodd over there, so you're working on several pictures at once?
I always do, yeah. I always work on, with the 100 heads I was working on 4 or 5 at a time, and that's why the space I would have them laid out, and the drying time. So you work on one, and as that's drying, you'd work on another one, and you have that movement. So I think I've always worked like that.
Yeah, well, I've never been in an artist studio that's so big. You've got so much space here, haven't you?
I have, I'm lucky.
More space than Picasso, I think.
Well, that'd be great, yeah.
Anyway, I'll let you get on with George, so thanks very much indeed, Tony. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're crossing the Mersey now and going over to New Brighton, which was of course once a great holiday resort, and there are signs that it's coming back to life again. One of those signs is an extraordinary place called Fort Perch Rock, which is around 200 years old and was really put up as defences in case the French decided to attack us. It's a fabulous place for kids to play in, and they also have a Mersey Beat museum there and a stage, and we're going to meet Dave Williams from the Liverpool beat group The Jaywalkers and Ray O'Brien, author of a book on Beatle venues on Merseyside, There Are Places I'll Remember. Our first location is here at Fort Perch Rock, an extraordinary place with a wide history to it, and we're in the Mersey Beat room here, and there are Mersey Beat events held here every week pretty well. Right?
That's right, Spencer. Well, certainly every month there's a Mersey Beat show. I think you're coming to one. I was here last month with Ronnie Ashton, Billy J. Kramer's brother, and we've had a whole variety of artists here, yes.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of people around who still play the Mersey Beat music from the 60s, aren't there?
Amazingly, we've got one Sissington next to us.
Yes,
at the
indeed.
moment, Dave Williams, but apart from Dave, yes, there's still many sort of keeping the flag flying, as they say.
Yeah, we've been playing ever since the 60s. I was with Dale Robertson, the Jaywalkers in Group 1, and we try and sort of keep the flag flying. We play quite regularly.
And how authentic do you think you're playing now vis-a-vis the 60s?
We do much more variety now in a way, rather than some of the bands still follow very closely to the 60s sound, but we have a young lady singer who was the daughter of one of our passed away friends in the band. So we try and do a much greater variety. It gives you a greater scope where you can play them.
And you'd be very much louder now, wouldn't you?
Oh, I should think so, yeah. But we're not that loud, but not, a lot louder than we would be those days anyway.
How loud were the Beatles in those days? Because people say Pete Best was a real powerhouse
Well,
drummer.
we thought they were extremely loud. I think if we turn the clock back now, perhaps they weren't as loud as today's bands, but Pete Best's bass drum we felt was the greatest force behind the Beatles when they came back. We hadn't heard the power like that, and we put it all down to his bass drum work, really.
Yeah. And what about the covers that you were doing? Were you trying to copy the American bands exactly, the American originals?
I think most of the bands did that. And I think if bands didn't cover them exactly, we used to sort of criticise them, which was wrong, really. Now, Beatles came back, and I think they put their own mark on some of the stuff. They would do it slightly different, and looking back on it, this was really the clever part, I think, really, in a way. Because they put their own style to it and made the same tune sound, somewhat different, but in their own way, really.
Yeah. And did you think right from the start that the Beatles were really the top band?
No doubt about it, absolutely. Not everybody did, but I think those who didn't were kidding themselves. I think that in some ways they must have been envious. But in all honesty, I thought as soon as we saw them, because that was my kind of music, good, strong rock and roll. I mean, they were against the norm, really, in a way. They did things the way they felt.
Yeah.
I had to admire that.
And when you saw them, did you think, oh, I hope they're going to do so-and-so tonight?
Oh, every time, yeah.
And what were your favourites?
Well, I like Dizzy and Miss Lizzie and stuff like that, Long Tall Sally, the hefty stuff, Little Richard. Chuck Berry.
Yeah, you saw them a lot of times too, Ray.
I did, certainly.
Did you have certain songs that you thought, I hope the Beatles will do this tonight?
Well, that's right. I had a quirky one, Besame Mucho, which you probably remember, Dave. They used to do that sort of thing, didn't they, in the early days?
That's true, yeah.
And I also remember them doing a picture of you, which Joe Brown had.
I think
George used to do that one.
The Joe Brown stuff. Yeah, that's right. I used to enjoy doing that. And Henry VIII I Am. That was another
Henry
one.
VIII I Am, yes.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of humour, wasn't there, in their act as well?
Right.
I think the difference, Dave, their personalities shone through, didn't they, as individuals?
Whereas other bands didn't seem to dwell on that.
No.
They tried to just do this stuff and, like I said, copy it, particularly Shadows. A lot of bands did Shadow stuff. We did that. And it was good. It was enjoyable, but there wasn't the personality there, was there?
Well, I say a lot of the other bands did a set.
Yeah.
The Beatles did a set and an act.
Show.
And that was followed by a lot of other bands.
Do you think the Beatles actually went on stage with a set list, though, or did they work to what the audience was responding to?
I wouldn't have thought they went on with the set list myself, whereas most of us probably did. I think they probably played the crowd, just fathomed out what they felt they should do, and people would shout for things, like you said, right?
Yep.
And they would respond by doing it, because of course that was playing into their hands, wasn't it?
Yeah. Now, tell us about that Easter Monday that you were on the Cavern with the Beatles. This is 61, 62, is it?
Yeah, something like that, wasn't it? Yeah, and it was in the afternoon, I think. All the crowd started to mill outside, because they used to queue, of course, for the Beatles in Matthew Street.
Yeah. So this will be 62.
The young ladies had their rollers still in their hair, trying to make themselves look posh, and they brought their sandwiches all wrapped up, and they all rushed in as soon as they opened, all sat round the front. As soon as they got in there, of course, they opened up the butties and took out their rollers. And we were on as Group 1, and they weren't really interested in the other bands, to be honest. We went down all right, but of course, once the Beatles came on, we all thronged to the front, and the atmosphere was just electric. It was wonderful.
Yeah. So you were playing to a lot of people just taking their rollers out?
Well, in effect. Yes. They weren't really interested in what we were doing. We went okay,
Now, you lived over this side.
I always lived this
side. I mean, was this difficult for you playing all these venues in Liverpool? Because you did have a day job as well.
Yeah, I worked as a clerk. It was really. We used to have to sort of scrounge lifts off pals who had a car, or I had a scooter once. I used to go on a scooter with my actual guitar between my legs, balancing it through the Mersey Tunnel or across on the ferry across the Mersey, as it were.
And when did you sleep?
Not a lot.
And you played a lot of venues on the Wirral as well, did you?
Yeah, more or less all the venues. Yeah. We were out 7 nights a week.
Yeah.
And I think most bands were at the time.
And what were your favourite venues?
Favourite venues? Well, I mean, I liked the Cavern. And Aintree Institute, I think that was a great venue for sound. Some of the others didn't have the sound that particular place had. I liked that one, yeah.
And what about the ones on this side of the water?
This side, we didn't do that many this side, but I think the Grosvenor Ballroom in Wallasey was quite a good one too, and Hume Hall. That was like a little bit up market, if you like, in some respects.
Yeah. And what about you, Ray? Did you see the bands over here?
No, because really I saw them at the Tower Ballroom. I saw the Beatles at the Tower Ballroom, but I was living in Liverpool. I'm from Liverpool and was living in Liverpool then. And you know yourself, Dave, there was a bit of a divide, wasn't there, with Liverpool and Wirral? It's that thing called the River Mersey, and it was like coming to another place. When you're younger, not now. I mean, we're doing backwards and forwards all the time, aren't we?
A lot of people we spoke to in Liverpool didn't really know where Easton was. I live in Easton, which was, as you probably know, about 10 miles up the Wirral. But they'd never heard of it because they didn't get around. It sounds ridiculous now, but they didn't have cars and there wasn't money about. So a lot of people hadn't travelled very far from the actual city to elsewhere. You know?
I mean, that's one of the things about the start of Mersey Beat, really. You have these little pockets of beat groups in places like Crosby, and then eventually they all connect to meet up at the Cavern. But there were a lot of people who were all going in the same direction without knowing the others were doing it.
That's
really.
right. And you didn't really get to know these guys. You knew them by sight, but there were very few who you knew by name. Certainly not the surname. You might have known by the Christian name.
And what was going to the Tower Ballroom like? Because this was the biggest place around, wasn't it?
Unbelievable, really. I mean, we'd never seen a venue with that many people in, particularly when you did have the Beatles on. 4,000 plus in a venue was incredible. Because most of the places was only a few hundred, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And having the sort of standard of the stars on stage there, and you were so close to them, weren't you, basically?
Yeah.
I mean, that was very unusual, rather than seeing them on the Empire when you'd not been able to touch him effectively. It was like really unusual, that.
Yeah. Because, I mean, nowadays, I mean, arenas fill up with 10,000 people, but it was so unusual then to have 4,000 people interested in beat music there at the Tower Ballroom. So I think, in a way, Sam Leach was a visionary, really, to book the Tower Ballroom for those beat dances. He couldn't have known at first that the audiences were going to be there.
Very much so. And an amazing thing for me here, Spencer, is that the biggest band in the world, the biggest audience they ever played before in a live concert on the UK mainland, I emphasise that, including Belfast, was the Tower Ballroom.
Tower Ballroom is correct.
And when you think Wembley Stadium, 100,000, the Stones played there, didn't they?
Yeah.
The Beatles was just under 4,000
That's
people.
right, yeah.
Yeah, so it was a shock for them when they went over to America, certainly, and were playing big arenas and stadiums then.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been difficult with the sound when you think, you know, the amount of equipment they had to actually get it sounding anything like, because they didn't have the equipment to fill a place like that, really, did they?
And what was it actually like in the Tower Ballroom at one of those dances, Ray?
It was a fantastic atmosphere, and I think I remember we're going back a long, long time. We're coming over on the ferry, Dave, for that, and they used to lay coaches on going back to Liverpool city centre. Yeah. I mean, people have told me about the Tower Ballroom. I never saw any, but there used to be trouble there, but I never ever saw that. I mean, I saw the Rolling Stones there as well, but I never saw any hint of trouble. It was just a fantastic atmosphere, people dancing away, weren't they, and singing and literally rocking in the aisles.
We didn't see a lot of trouble, really, when you consider how many people went to these places and how compacted they were into them. We never saw a great deal of trouble at venues, very much at all, to be quite truthful with you.
I don't think people drank nearly as much in those days.
No. And most of them didn't have a bar, did they?
Yeah.
And it was a case, we didn't have the money, did you? Let's be honest about it.
Yeah. And what about stage introductions? When the Beatles came on, who usually did the talking? What do you remember?
Of the Beatles themselves?
Yes.
Well, I think Paul did quite a lot of the talking, as I recollect, and I think he was the main spokesman, really. What do you have said, really?
You're talking about a compere?
When they were introducing the songs and things.
I would say mainly Paul, wasn't it? Mainly Paul. Certainly in the early days.
Yeah.
I think John started to do it, didn't he? Later on.
Yes, that's right.
You know, when they became sort of internationally known, if you like.
Oh, yes.
But certainly, I always remember the Cavern Paul doing most of the stuff as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I think he did. I think they were quite happy with him doing that, because I think George was a little on the shy side.
He was on the shy.
John really just wanted to get on with doing the songs, didn't he, basically?
And were you surprised when they replaced Pete Best with Ringo Starr?
Oh, yeah, I think everybody was. You know, I think it was a shock, wasn't it? Major shock.
So there hadn't been any rumbling, sort of, Pete Best isn't quite right for the Beatles?
Well, I don't think the average person had thought anything about this, really, no.
Well, you wouldn't be an average person, because you'd be backstage with them.
Well, that's probably true.
Well,
but you never got any inkling that anything was wrong?
No.
Yeah.
No. I don't think many people did, really, at the time.
Yeah. And do you think Ringo fitted in straight away?
Well, soon after, particularly once they started writing their own stuff. I mean, I personally think Ringo fitted in extremely well on all the records. You know, I'm not decrying Pete. I think Pete was a great guy. He fitted in what they were doing on all the covers. But the stuff they've done since, I think if you listen to the drumming, I think it's just right for what the sound is, quite honestly.
And do you feel a little bitter that you didn't make records yourself in the 60s? Do you wish you had?
Yeah, I wish we'd made some records. We had made a little contract to make a record at Cavan. Cavan had a recording studio, I think.
In the mid-60s, yes.
Yes, that's right.
And that's the reason they went bankrupt.
We never got around to doing it. I wish we had, but I don't regret not making it big, if you like. Not that I'm saying we were good enough to make it big. I always felt I had the balance, having the group as shall we say, a hobby, and our job as well, because we're family people as well. I think for all those who made it, there were hundreds who didn't. And sadly, in some cases, they're finding the problem of it now, later in life.
Yeah, well, Dave Williams of the J Walk, has been great to meet you.
Thank you, Spencer.
Cheers. And Ray, we'll be chatting again in a minute or two.
Thank you.
Ray and I are now sitting on the stage of the Grosvenor Ballroom, which is in Liskeard in the borough of Wallasey. And above the door there's a plaque that says the Beatles played here many times. It doesn't actually say how many times, but I'm sure that Ray is going to know.
And he knows. It's 14 times. It's 3 as the Silver Beatles, B-E-E-T-L-E-S, 4 as the Silver Beatles, B-E-A-T-L-E-S, and 7 as the actual Beatles.
So we're talking about 1960, 61?
1960 and 1961, that's correct.
Right. And how did they come to be here?
Well, they came to be here through Paramount Enterprises. Alan Williams was responsible for the early bookings.
Mm-hmm. So he booked them in here. He thought this was a suitable venue for them.
Yes, he booked them in here. it was obviously it was a place that had rock bands. Originally, up to 1960, it didn't have any rock bands here. It tended to be more sort of folk and country and western and even jazz. And then, of course, 60 things changed, didn't they? Like they did at the Cavern, and rock bands started to appear here, and the Beatles were one of those bands. The actual owner, a guy called Les Dodd, didn't like it at first. He didn't want it. He felt they were far too noisy for this area.
Well, it's quite a nice gig for them to have here, isn't it? It's a nice ballroom.
Well, I would have thought the sort of places they were playing pre-60, and they come to somewhere like this, which, as we can see, is a nice ballroom, nice decor. Yes, it'd be quite a big place for them, quite a nice place for them to play.
So they'd have Pete Best with them, but not on all 14 gigs.
No, well, strangely, Spencer, in the very early days when they came here, they didn't have Pete Best at all. They didn't, often, as you know, didn't have a drummer. There was a drummer called Tommy Moore. And there's an interesting story here, because on one occasion, it was in 1960, he didn't turn up and they didn't have a drummer. And there was just the three of them. And they were on the stage where we're sitting now. And I don't know if John Lennon meant it, but in his sort of sardonic sense of humour, he shouted out to the audience, have we got anyone here who can play the drums? And apparently this big guy, big teddy boy, I'll have a go, mate, came up here on the stage, and he was absolutely dreadful. He was hopeless. But they couldn't get him off the stage. And he stayed on right until the interval. And for all the talk about the Beatles, we all know they weren't, in the Liverpool sense, hard lads. And they couldn't handle this guy to get off the stage. So apparently, during the interval, Alan Williams was not here on the night. He was somewhere in Liverpool. And they were able to contact him and said, Alan, you better get over here and sort something out for us. And Alan came over in his car and through some sort of persuasion got this guy eventually off the stage. But he was all set for touring with them and everything, you know.
Yes, and I wonder who Ronnie was. We could do with finding him.
Well, strangely enough, about 2 years ago, I put an appeal out in one of the local papers and we asked if he's still around to come forward, but we got no response. But I'm sure he is out there somewhere.
Well, I remember the first ever Mersey Beatles convention, which was organised by Alan Williams and Bob Wooler, and it said, a Beatle is going to star here, special guest star, but it didn't say who, you see. So we all trooped along to this. This is in the late 70s, wondering who on earth was going to be this Beatle that was going to be appearing at the Mersey Beatle convention. And it turned out to be Tommy Moore, the drummer that you mentioned.
Oh,
yes.
right.
And he played as a drummer with them on a few occasions. But then his girlfriend said, no, you've got a decent job at Garston Bottle Works.
That's
you continue with that.
Yes, you carry on with your career.
Indeed.
This is no good for you.
Okay. Well, let's find another Beatles site on the world. Now we travel a few miles to Port Sunlight, but it's also like travelling back in time because it is a beautifully preserved village, and at one time everybody who lived here worked for the soap manufacturers Lever Brothers. We're in a very picturesque part of the world now. We're in Port Sunlight and we're in Hume Hall, which is where the Beatles played a few times. Ray's going to tell me how many.
4 times, Spencer.
Yeah. And this is when they were starting to make it, wasn't it? I mean, it's a very nice venue, this good, prestigious place.
It's also a very significant historical venue for them because it's where Ringo Starr made his debut in August 1962 and where they did the radio interview for Clatterbridge and Cleaver Hospitals in October 62.
Yeah, so that would be August the 18th, 62, wasn't
August the 18th for the horticultural show of all things, eh?
Yes, and indeed there's a poster up they've still got for that.
Still got
and
it.
It says the Beatles, the North's #1 rock combo.
Which was 2 months before Love Me Do.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
So they were already had that reputation even when they didn't have a record out.
Well, I think they had, hadn't they? Because we all know in Liverpool they had the reputation, and then they were going out to the northern towns and to the Wirral and to Manchester, so they were the #1 band in the north at that time, yeah.
Now, there's a picture of them up here, of them being interviewed. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, the interviewer was Monty Lister, who is not on the photograph, but his 2 young assistants are. That's Peter Smethurst and Malcolm Threadgill, 2 16-year-old lads who assisted Monty at Radio Clatterbridge and Cleaver Hospitals and were allowed to ask 1 question.
Yeah, it's worth saying why this interview is so important, actually, because this is the first recorded interview with the Beatles, and they just had Love Me Do out, and Monty had gone along there with a huge tape recorder because it was very difficult to do interviews on location in those days. He took this tape recorder along, probably plugged it into the light socket and then asked his questions. Did a 7 or 8 minute interview with them, allowed these 2 lads to ask a question each, and it actually turns out to be a very revealing interview with the Beatles, doesn't it?
Well, the revealing one to me is the dynamics of it, really. Paul, there's a photograph of it, and Paul is certainly taking the lead role, and he answers most of the questions. Ringo hardly says a word, perhaps not surprisingly because he'd only just joined the band, or recently joined the band. George Harrison says very little, and John Lennon actually isn't that verbal in the interview.
Yeah. And interesting, other bands played here as well, didn't they?
Yes, most of the other bands, yes, played here. The Foremost, the Swinging Blue Jeans, I believe, the Big Three, the Undertakers, a lot of the Merseyside bands played here.
I said the Foremost because they had a couple of hit singles, and on that poster that's here, it says the 4Js. And
they were the 4Js then, of course. Yes, they were the 4Js then.
Yeah. And how did the dances go down here with them?
I think they went down very well. As we can see it, I think for the bands coming over, certainly from Liverpool, a lot of them were playing in, I don't know, they were playing in small clubs and little places. We only have to look around this place. They must have thought, well, goodness me, what sort of place this is? Yeah. It was a fantastic, not just the setting, the village, the actual building itself is so grand, isn't it?
Yes, yes, you get a great feeling coming in here.
You do?
And it is a marvellous place.
It's a function place, and I presume most of the bands were playing, the Beatles were playing, weren't they, for the horticultural show. So it'd be an organisation, I think, that would organise the dance, and they'd book a band.
Yeah. And the interview that Monty Lister did, it looks like they're in a small room, doesn't it?
A very small room, Spencer, and it's right behind us. It's this wooden door, which I believe, on good authority, is now used as a paint store.
Right. And what about the Beatles themselves? Where would the stage have been?
The stage would be here, just behind us here.
Great. Well, it's a lovely venue, this. It'd be nice if they used it for dances again, in fact, I think. But they have a lot of functions on here still, and they're preparing for dinner tonight, as you can see. Anyway, let's go to another venue now on the Wirral, where the Beatles played up. We travel another few miles and go to Irby Village Hall, and Ray and I are going to meet up with Mary Newton, who booked the Beatles in 1962. We're in a lovely little suburban village hall in a place called Irby, which is on the Wirral, and the Beatles played here 7th of September 1962. And it does seem to me, Ray, that at that time Ringo Starr just joined the band. Brian Epstein was getting the Beatles work whenever he could, and he took anything that was going.
Yes, and not only that, Spencer, I think he was a man of honour. He'd made some of these bookings several months before, and despite the fact that they were on the verge of stardom, Love Me Do was coming out in just a few weeks' time, he honoured the bookings.
Well, indeed, we know that because we got the booking letter here, 30th of July 1962, when Pete Best was still with the band.
That's right.
And this is Mary Newton here at the Newton Dancing School, who actually booked them here. So what made you want to get the Beatles for your dance? Why the Beatles?
Only because they were sort of partly known as a smallish band, as many of the others were around about that time. And I ran this dancing school here, and I had a ballroom class, and every month we had a band of some description. Yeah. And therefore, it was just a case of booking somebody that somebody knew.
Yeah.
And they were only here for an hour.
Yeah. And did you know Nems Enterprises and Brian Epstein at all?
No. Actually, I got in touch with this, and then it sort of built up from there.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And all sorts of bands that we had also given us, oh, you ought to have them, and you ought to have them. But they were only here for an hour,
yes,
and I think it was £60, was it?
£35. £35. It says here, I would now confirm this engagement at a fee of £35, and the playing time will be 1 hour.
That's right.
So that's it.
And we had a supporting band as well.
Yes.
And we paid them, and then we didn't have enough money to pay the Beatles at the end of the night.
Really?
No.
Well, how much would it be to get in? About 7 and sixpence or something?
It was on the ticket.
It'll be about 7 and sixpence or something.
Something like that.
So,
and then, so what we did, across the road from here, there used to be a bowling place, you know, and the hall, and I actually booked this hall, and we had a jumble sale.
Yes.
And then paid them the rest of the money.
Oh, right.
And then a little bit later on, Brian Epstein was he was actually writing in, I think it was in the Echo, he had some, writing about them.
I think that would be...
He said, in actual fact, he said, we went to one hall where we were paid in pennies and halfpennies.
Right.
And was that here, do you think?
And that was here, yes.
And what do you remember of the Beatles' performance that night? Did you feel you got your £35 worth?
Oh, yes, I'm sure we did, yes. I mean, we were all sort of on the ball, if you know what I mean. You know, we were really... we've got somebody, because when they became more famous, it was a case of, well, we had them at the village hall, you know.
And were people screaming for them then at all?
Yes, they were in a way, but I mean, they weren't that famous, really, until their first record came out, and then of course.
Yeah. Which, as I say, Mary, was only a few weeks after.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was. I mean, we actually thought that it was that week that they first put the record out, but apparently it wasn't. I think it was
just a little bit
2 or
after.
3 late. Yeah.
And Ray, when we were in Fort Perch Rock, we saw a suitcase that's connected to here.
Yes, well, that's another amazing story. That was after the evening, and Mary can correct me on this, but I think I'm right. A suitcase was left behind. Yeah. And the next day, a guy called Ernie Earlham, who was on the door,
who was on the door, yeah,
and was
still on the door,
and he's still on. He's actually still on the door, and he was on the door on the night. And when he went into the little changing room where the Beatles changed, which is just behind me, he found a suitcase which was marked, and it was one of the old-fashioned holiday suitcases. I think they were made out of well, sort of cardboardy, wasn't it? You know, I used to have one, and it had GH Speak. Hamburg Beatles party on it. Yeah. So the next day, I believe, Mary, he phoned Nems Enterprises and said, one of your band, one of the Beatles, one of the group, has left a suitcase behind. And they said, thank you for letting us know, we'll come and collect it. Yeah, and they never did.
And what was in this suitcase?
There were some leads, I think.
Oh.
I think it was a load of rubbish, really.
Nothing that George Harrison would have missed, particularly.
Not particularly.
We heard there was some leads and little bits of wire. Yes. Now, my little imagination, which is very vivid, says they may have been guitar strings, but we don't know.
No.
Yes.
But anyway, the suitcase has now found its place, a good home, and it's in Fort Perch Rock in the Beatles Museum in New Brighton.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, gosh.
And I know that you knew Paul McCartney's father. Did you know him before this gig?
I knew... yes, well, it was all round about the same time. I mean, I knew his father and his stepmother.
Yes,
and
Angela,
his stepsister,
yes,
Ruth. And because they went to the same dancing school, I was teaching at a school in Heswall.
Yes.
At the same time as I was teaching here. And Ruth went there and my daughter went there, and they became very good friends, actually.
Yeah. So this is, the McCartneys have moved from Forthland Road and they've come over to Rembrandt on the Wirral, is that right?
They come to Rembrandt then, yes.
Which was a great step up for the family, wasn't it?
Well,
a very big house.
Yeah. My daughter, she used to go and stay.
Yes.
And the only thing she was interested in was sleeping in the room with the golden discs.
Oh, that's a very good...
Didn't. I mean, there could be... I mean, the animal used to go there, and all these different bands. Paul often used to say, oh, well, use my house on the way, if you're touring, you know. And Angela used to say to me, I used to go around the bedrooms in the morning to find out who was actually sleeping in my house.
And when you say animals, you mean the group?
Yeah?
Yes,
not animals.
Indeed.
Not animals, no.
Yes, I know Long John Baldry stayed at Rembrandt, for example. Yes. Yes, and Freddie Starr was there one day, and
well, we had Freddie Starr here.
Yes, and he got behind the curtains, and then they opened the curtains, and he was pretending to do a striptease. So that happened in Rembrandt as well.
Well, I hope his hamster didn't stay there, Spencer.
Oh, this is long before hamsters, and I see Freddie Starr played here as well. So they had a few groups here as well.
We had the Big Three. We had Jerry and the Pacemakers. We had, you know, all round about that time.
Yeah.
But we had them all once a month.
Yeah. So even though you lost money on it, you feel very glad that you had the Beatles here?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, it's turned into a lifelong story, hasn't it? Really, when you think about it.
Yes. Well, indeed, you've done. It's splendid that you did this, Mary.
Oh yes.
And thank you for sharing these memories with us.
Oh,
thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mary.
Welcome.
We're back on the Liverpool side of the Mersey now, and we're just a couple of miles outside the city centre at Everton Cemetery. Why are we here? Well, when I tell you we're going to the Jewish part of the cemetery, you can make a good guess. Ray and I are going to meet up with Joe Flannery, who, like Brian Epstein, managed groups on Merseyside. So we're here standing by Brian Epstein's grave. There are a number of Epsteins who were also buried in this cemetery, and Joe Flannery, a former Merseybeat manager, great friend of Brian Epstein. You're someone who comes here quite a bit.
I come here, well, for sure, once a year, and that's on his anniversary. And I have special permission from the rabbi to put a posy, just only what you would wear at a wedding, a little posy, or a sheath, I think they call them. And I just put a little card on it, and it's the same every year. Fond memories of happy times.
Yes, because you don't.
That's what I say.
Because you don't generally see flowers on graves in Jewish cemeteries.
Well, as you can see today, there's they're imitation, but they're nevertheless flowers.
And somebody has been from Canada too.
Canada. Yes. Well.
How well did you know Brian?
I knew Brian very well. I was 4 when I first met Brian, and he must have been just a young baby in his nursery. It was a close-knit family when they liked to keep together. I mean, as years went by and we became managers of our
groups. You had Beryl Marsden.
I had Beryl Marsden. I had my brother Lee Curtis in the All Stars. He had the Beatles, Jerry and the Perch, so on. We all know the stable. And as time went by, we worked together. We used to say our businesses, which I was Carlton Brook Management, he was NEMS Enterprises, and we worked in tandem. We used to tell people, we work in tandem.
Yes.
That means we're not absolute partners. I didn't own half of his company and he didn't own half of mine, but we worked in tandem together, worked very close. And it worked out, and it was great. It was very good. We had some nice times together.
It's amazing to think, isn't it, Ray, that here lies a man who changed Liverpool forever, changed popular music forever, changed popular culture forever. Everything changed because of him.
What I find amazing, Spencer, is we see here he passed away aged 32.
Yes.
So at 27 years of age he started managing the Beatles. Exactly. And in those 5 years, relatively young years, what was achieved.
And he seems so much older than them in the film, doesn't he?
He did. I think
because of his bearing. And
yes.
And his authority.
He was only 6 years older than John Lennon.
Yes.
But I think because of his bearing, wasn't it, Joe?
Yes.
And also, you know, whereas they had the haircuts and he had the businessman's style, didn't he, really?
When I was asked to go to the Radio City, and the owners of Radio City were opening the Beatles, not Story, the other one, the Beatle exhibition, I think it was called, in Seal Street.
Yes.
I was asked, would I go to this meeting, and when I first stood up at in the boardroom, I said, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to realise from the word go, we're talking about a young man here who ran the Beatles. We're not talking about a man who would have probably been 50 today or so.
Yes.
You know, we're not talking about an older person. We're talking about a person who could have been the fifth Beatle. He wasn't too old to be that. You know what I mean? And his mannerism was so beautiful. I'll be honest with you, this morning, when I walked in here this morning and we're over there looking at something else, I looked over here and I said, there he is over there. It stands out. He's standing out still.
Yes.
Look around. there he is, shining.
And did his death take you completely by surprise?
It did. I mean, it was an August bank holiday when he died, when it was announced. And I was sitting with a friend of mine in his house. His name is Yankel Feather. And I was sitting in his house. I had to remind him of this just the other day. He's been on the phone to me. And I said to him, do you remember where you were when we heard Brian was dead? And he said, not clearly. So I said, do you remember sitting with me in your house, in your kitchen, having dinner that you had prepared? And the phone went, and it was Mr. Rex Macon to tell Yankel Feather that Brian had been found dead in his apartment in London. And that was a shock.
Yes.
I mean, it absolutely ruined our dinner.
Yeah.
We didn't finish our dinner. But that's when I first found out and how shocked I was.
Yeah. And he was died in London, and there was a service in London, and then the body was brought up here, and there was
That's
a funeral service here.
Yes, I didn't attend. Which
either of them?
No. When you say either of them,
well, there was a service.
No, I didn't attend any of them. I understand what you mean now. No, I was at home, as I've just told you, grieving, if you like, and well, just afterwards, his brother Clive, who was buried further over in this cemetery, did say to me when we became partners afterwards, after Brian's death, he said to me, why did you never ever come along to Brian's funeral? I said, I was at home, I didn't know what to do, and I just sat and I remembered Brian my own way, and I didn't attend either of the services. But I believe we're still together.
Yes. And he's here with his parents, isn't he?
He's in the same
Can you tell us
cemetery.
about Harry and Queenie?
Yes. Harry, his father, when I was a young boy, I told you I knew Brian from I was, say, 4. His father used to hold 2 hands in front of me, and he used to say, which one? And he used to call me Yossel. Well, that's Jewish for Joseph.
Right.
And he used to say, come on, Yossel, choose. And one would be copper, and one would be a silver 6pence. And if I picked the copper, God help me, it'd be a penny.
Yes.
And he'd say, never mind, Joseph, there it is, Yossel. And then if sometimes I might pick the 6pence. That was my lucky day.
Right.
So I could either gain 6pence or a penny.
Yes.
And that was Harry with me. That's how he
Yes.
treated me. I always remember when I came down to the cavern when things were really running. You know, the Beatles had taken off, and I went down to the cavern, and Paddy, who used to be the doorman, he said, you've got guests down below in the cavern. So I said, who are they? He said, well, I said, well, please tell me. So he said, it's Mr. Epstein and his brother Clive. So when I got down into the bowels of the cavern, going down those steps, I went over to Mr. Epstein. I said, hello, Mr. Epstein. Never ever called him Harry, because I knew him from a child, so it was always Mr. Epstein. And I never ever called his mother, Brian's mother, Queenie.
Was that her actual name, Queenie?
As far as I know. I don't know, but as far as I know, I've never heard anybody else who was close to her calling her anything else but Queenie. Even Clive, up to his death, called his mother Queenie.
Yes.
So maybe it was an expression of you know, some people call their little girls princess.
Yes.
So it might have been something.
And very often with Jewish families, the mother is very dominant.
Oh,
would
yes,
you think the Queenie was?
Yes, in a very nice, beautiful way. She was never, she never ever came across as a demanding woman. She didn't demand their love, but you could see it was there. It was always there.
Yeah. Yes. And did Brown say to you at any stage, I've just seen this group, the Beatles, they're wonderful? Did he really say, this group is going to be bigger than Elvis, right at the start?
Well, that was part of our tandem thing. You know, we were very close, and we did plan little things together. I mean, I was in a pub in Birkenhead, facing the Majestic Ballroom, where the Beatles were appearing on one of my shows that I was running at the Majestic Ballroom. And we were all over in the pub, and Bill, Harry was there, and a few more people from George Harrison from the Liverpool Echo was there. Not George Harrison, the guitarist.
Yes, the journalist, yes.
The journalist. Very nice man, George Harrison. We were all there, and I just took something in my head while we were sitting there. And after all, it is show business, so what lies I might tell you now about, there were white lies.
Yes.
And I said to Brian, I said, sit tight. I said, but you're going to get a phone call any minute, you know, like any minute you'll get a phone call. And off I went to the phone, the public phone. And I asked the barman, is Mr. Epstein there? Oh yes. Put on an American accent. And I was Colonel Tom Parker, phoning from Hollywood or Los Angeles, wherever it was. And I said, I'd like to speak to Mr. Epstein, please. And they went and said, Colonel Tom Parker's on the phone for you, Mr. Epstein. And he was full of the joys of spring, and off he went. And I'm standing at the other end of the phone, and I'm telling a cock and bull story, and he's laughing his head off. And back he went. He said, Bill Harry said, what was that? I said, oh, it was Colonel Tom Parker, but I'll tell you about that later on as it gets a bit more. And that's how the thing came of They Will Meet Elvis.
And they met Elvis in 1965, I think, yes.
I think so, yeah. But it was all wonderful, and it was great fun. We had nice times together, and we'd have good fun. I taught George Harrison to drive from my apartment. I bought...
Now that's interesting, because I'd always thought it was his dad who was a bus driver that did that.
No, I taught him to drive.
Right, okay.
And, so I surprise you every time. There's always a surprise. Always a surprise.
Right, okay, yeah.
And
I know he was the first of the Beatles to drive.
Yes, he was. Yes, and I bought a Vauxhall Cresta, which was probably, you know, we're talking about not long after the war years, when we're going back to the 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking only about 12, 15 years at the most.
1957 or 58, yes.
So we were beginning then to get these nice coloured and American-looking cars. Mine was a very spread, it was the top range of Vauxhall at the time.
Right.
And it was a beautiful-looking car. And I'll never forget, I used to run George home when we'd finish. And the bowling alley was finished, and we'd had our nice night, and we're all falling asleep. And I'd end up in George's house having breakfast with him and his dad. His dad would get up very early because he was a bus driver.
Right.
And he would do our breakfast. But on the way home one particular night, I'll never forget, George said to me, Joe, sell this car to me. And I looked at him and I said, don't talk ridiculous. You'll never be able to pay me for it.
Wonderful.
So that was that with the car.
Well, before we leave this site and leave you, I'm sorry to say, Joe,
right.
let me just ask you two quick questions that I'd like your answers on. And first of all, the Beatles haircut, because that has actually got something to do with you or your mother.
Well, yes, and it is truthful.
Right.
It's absolutely truthful. I'm standing at the man's grave here today, and when they first visited my apartment in Tube Group, I had a picture of my mother on my television console, and John Lennon walked straight to it, and he picked it up. He said, "Is this your girlfriend, Flannery?" So I said, "No." He said, "Well, who is it?" Because he liked French ladies, you know.
Yeah.
He was, and he said she looked like this. This looks like Leslie Caron.
Yes.
I'll show it to you in a minute, and it does look like she's got the same mouth. But he said, that's beautiful, that. He said, come on, tell us, is this your girlfriend? I said, that's my mother when she was 16. I said, beautiful. Put it down, respected it, put it down nicely. And then the next time he came, which was about a week later, he walked straight to my mother's picture again, and he picked it up and he said, I've been thinking about this all week. And he held the picture up like that from the television console, and of course he was standing with his back to the rest of us in the room. On the settee behind him was George, Pete Best at the time, Pete Best and John. Paul. Excuse me. So he just went like that and he put it over his shoulder and he said, this is the way we're going to have our hair, boys. He remembered the hairstyle that my mother's got in this picture.
So?
And it's so close, so, you know, and that was it.
And it was done at Horn Brothers, Brian's hairstylist? Horn Brothers hairdressers?
My mother's...
No, the Beatles.
Yes, that was...
Right.
Yes.
And the final question I want to ask you, Joe, because one of the things that's in a lot of Beatle books, and you must know the answer.
Right.
The Beatles had their first single, Love Me Do, out.
Yes.
And a lot of the Beatle books say that Brian Epstein bought 10,000 copies and thereby got it into the charts. You knew Nem's, his shop and everything.
Yes.
Did you ever see 10,000 singles?
I don't know if it was 10,000, but it was a heap of records. And I met Paul in London, in the West End. I was doing business with Decca at the time. They were in London doing something, whatever they were doing. I always met up with them and Brian. And I said, how are you doing? He said, he said, we're broke. He said, we're skint. He said, I wish he'd sell them records that he's got in the shop. He said, because, I mean, even though he had a contract with them, and whatever he wanted to do, he had the freedom to do it.
Yes.
You know, and okay, if in those days you could buy your way into the charts.
Yes.
I mean, you've only got to go and buy 10 records today and you'll be in the charts.
Allegedly, yes.
And,
but you certainly could in those days. Yeah.
Yes, in those
and,
days.
And so you think he did that?
Well, I know, yes, he did do it. I know he did it.
Well, we're going off to West Derby in a minute, and we're going to be meeting what's happening. Well, we're going to be seeing what's happening in the Casbah Club.
Oh, right.
And meeting the best family.
Yes.
But you're here at Brown's gravesite.
They were the best family.
Yes.
You just said I'm going to meet the best family.
Is there any final message that you give to Brown? What would you say?
Only to say that his memory lives on, and there are negotiations that we should have a statue for you. I'm speaking to him now, you've asked me to, and I would hope that will be successful, that we will have a statue in Liverpool for Brian. I really do. He deserves it.
Yes.
Joe Flannery, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe.
Okie dokie.
We're travelling a few miles from Everton to West Derby now, and to that Casbah Cafe Club in the Best's family home. There are three brothers, Pete Best of course, Rory and Rogue, and it's Rogue who's going to tell us about the club. We're in the Casbah Club, and Rogue, I saw something in the papers the other day that this building is now preserved forever. What exactly is that about?
It's been made an English heritage site, which is it's fantastic actually, because it means that we're recognised as being a national treasure.
Great.
And I think that we're the only Beatles site to be given such an award, so we're very pleased about that. Very pleased.
And you've opened it up to the public in recent years, haven't you? But it's opened, as it were, by appointment only.
It is by appointment only. Because of our own busy schedules, it has to be done that way. So basically through the internet, or make a phone call, get hold of someone at the Casbah office, and get to see the club.
Right. And how did this Casbah come about? It opened 1959.
It's a funny story how it came about. My mother was watching a programme called the Friday Night Special, and it was doing a feature on the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London, talking about Cliff Richard and the Shadows being discovered there, Tony Sheridan, Marty Wilde, you know all this, Spencer and Ray, anyway. And there was nothing like that in Liverpool. Rory and Pete had this huge gang of friends. my mother watched this programme, saw a niche in the market and thought, hey, why don't we do a beat club here? Why don't we do a coffee club? And it was done there and then. She told Pete and Rory and their friends, start clearing the cellars out tomorrow. We're going to do this beat bar stroke coffee bar. And that's how the club came about.
Do you think she started it with the idea of making money from it or not?
No, I think it was very much started as a way to get rid of Rory, Pete and their friends, to get them out the way for long periods of time rather than marauding through the house. And she touched on something that was very special because there was nothing like it in Liverpool. She was inundated with beat groups and she was inundated with the people that followed beat groups. So it was... the Casbah was a success from the word go.
Well, that's really where she was a bit of a visionary, really, because she decided not to have records played, or there may have been records played, but the main thing was live music. And there was nothing else sort of relatively near to the centre of town.
Live music, there was live groups every night. Obviously, the club's synonymous with the Beatles, but apart from the Beatles, you're talking Jerry and the Pacemakers, King Size Tail and the Dominoes, the Searchers, the Big Three, the Remo Four, the Foremost, and the list goes on. They were all here first, as it were.
Yeah. And how many people could you get in here?
The club comfortably would have 200 people in.
200 in here? Gosh,
well, crammed, but it goes to another extreme, because as the Beatles following grew in Liverpool, they'd play here on a Sunday night and they were pulling between 12 and 1,500 people. They couldn't fit in the club. My mother moved a till and a doorman, her bouncers, to the gate. Used to charge people at the gate, so we had a driveway that was full of Beatle fans, a back garden full of Beatle fans, the side of the house was full of Beatle fans, the club was full of Beatle fans. Maybe in the band room you can fit 60, 70 people. So you get 60, 70 people on one of those nights who could actually see them play, and 1,430 that could hear them. And we're just excited about being here.
And what about the neighbours?
I can't say the neighbours were overjoyed. I am aware that they put a petition together to have the club closed down. But the police force in West Derby, because the police station used to be stationed here back in the day, they came and saw my mother and said, we've got this huge petition to close the club down. We're not going to do anything about it because since the club's been opened, the crime rate in West Derby has practically disappeared. So in our books, you're doing a great job.
Yeah. Now, I know you went to the Cavern a lot, Ray. Did you ever come here?
I never came here, actually. I missed out, though, because I think this was the birthplace of Mersey Beat, wasn't it, Rogue?
It was.
As well as the Beatles. It's often said the birth of the Beatles, but I think...
It was the catalyst for that whole movement, which is something that we're very proud of.
Yeah. And interesting, Rogue, just picking up on Rogue, said your mum was very involved in another venue not far from here, St John's Hall, Tubrook, wasn't she? And they said a similar thing there, that the crime rate in Tubrook went down because of the bands that were playing.
Well, and a lovely story about St John's Hall. My mother expanded the Casbah Coffee Club. She started doing Casbah promotions, taking on halls, putting bands on there, as well as the nights at the club. St John's, I remember John McNally from The Searchers said it was the first time he saw the Beatles was at St John's Hall. And he said he'd never seen anything like it. He said there's these leather-clad lads, he said, doing the rock and roll music that they were doing. He said, but the other groups, he said, we'd all copied it from the records. He said, and the Beatles were doing their own thing. He said, so there's 2 and 3 lead guitar solos happening. He said, Lennon and McCartney are jumping on top of chairs and tables. He said, we'd never seen anything like it. He said, then at the end of the night, he said, I walked out of St John's Hall. He said, and John Lennon's rolling around on the floor with a teddy boy, beating the hell out of each other. He said, with the rest of the group shouting, come on, John, come on, John. He said, he just remembers walking away thinking, they're all insane. Yeah. But he never forgot the moments.
This cellar is comprised of several small rooms, and in one of the smallest rooms here, the Quarrymen actually played.
They did. They played on the Casbah's opening night, which was the 29th of August 1959, and they played on 13 occasions. Then there was a little fallout, and they said, we're never going to play here again. But they did, not as the Quarrymen, as the Beatles. It was their first show in Liverpool on the 17th of December 1960.
And why was there the fallout?
Ken Brown had stomach cramps, couldn't stand up, so he couldn't play. So my mother asked John, Paul and George, could they play without Ken? And they said, we can do the show without him. So my mother put Ken on the door. And at the end of the night, the boys came to get their money, get their wages to be paid. And my mother gave them their 5 shilling each. And they asked where Ken's 5 shilling was. And she said, well, I'll be giving Ken his 5 shilling in a moment for working the door. And they felt that Ken shouldn't get the 5 shilling, that they should get his 5 shilling to split between the 3 of them. My mother refused to do that because he'd still worked. So I could understand their side of the arguments. I can understand my mother's side of the arguments. Due to John's nature, we know why John wouldn't shift. Due to my mother's nature, we know why she wouldn't shift. So they parted then, not on particularly good terms, but all that was forgotten about later.
And what about the decorations in here? This is all the original decorations, isn't it?
Everything's as it was, except for the central heating. But everything's as it was.
You wouldn't need any with 200 people in here.
Don't need any central heating, no, hot enough. But this room was basically predominantly John's room to decorate. He did the ceiling. First of all, he did pot-belly figures, which is synonymous with John. My mother didn't like that, so he had to paint over it. He then painted the ceiling green. My mother didn't like that, at which point John basically just succumbed and said, please, just tell me what you want me to do. So she said, I want something African, John, something with that Aztec feel. So that's John's interpretation of African Aztec artwork. And as I mentioned to you before, Spencer and Ray, it didn't finish there because word went upstairs to say, hey, John's done the room. My mother comes down to find young John with his pocket knife scratching his name in the wall. So he got a crack on the back of the head for that, and his glasses got broken in the process, which he was very upset about.
And had he done the big spider at the back?
Pete did the spider, and John and Pete did the block ceiling above the spider in the band room.
Yeah. And does any music take place in here now? Do you have gigs in here?
On very rare occasions. The last time we did it was the Casbah's 40th anniversary, where we marqueed all the grounds, and we had 15 groups playing outside and 7 groups playing inside. And next year we're coming up to our 50th anniversary, so I think something like that could possibly happen again.
Yeah, and you're part of the Pete Best Band, aren't you now?
I am indeed.
And in fact, Pete's just written a whole series of autobiographical songs, I believe.
He has. The album Hayman's Green is due for release on the 16th of September. Make a note of that in your diary. Save the money up, buy the album. You'll be well pleased. And but we're well pleased. We've been working on it for 3 years, and accolade indeed when we delivered it to the label. And the CEO of the record company phoned me up, and I thought, oh, the CEO's phoning me, And he said, I need to speak to you about the album. I thought, oh God, what? So I said, what? Is there a problem? And he said, no. He said, no problem. He said, this far exceeded my wildest expectations. He said, I really didn't know what to expect from you fellas. He said, I think this album is as strong as anything the Beatles did when they were at their peak. So we were like, wow, because we actually thought it was stronger.
Now, I know Pete is your brother, but what is your take as a musician on Pete as a drummer?
Pete as a drummer, Pete had his own, and still does, has his own unique style. And I think anyone that truly shines has to be different. And with playing alongside Pete, there's nights when I look round and literally think, oh my God, he's on fire. If he was doing that 60 to 62 with the Beatles, it must have sounded unbelievable.
Great. Well, Rogue, it's been great to talk to you, and thanks very much for letting us see the Casbah.
Pleasure, right.
So, Ray, we've come a couple of miles from West Derby now. We're in Kensington, going towards the city centre. Why have you brought me here?
Well, we've come here because this is the Kensington recording studio, 38 Kensington, which was owned by a guy called Percy Phillips, who used to do demo discs for up-and-coming bands and singers from the area.
And what year are we talking about here?
We're talking sort of late 57 onwards, actually, 57, right through. This place was open as a recording studio, right way into the 60s and even into the 70s.
Yes, and there's a plaque above the door with 5 figures on it.
There's a plaque above the door and it says the Quarrymen.
Yes. And they were here on what date?
They were here actually on the 12th of July 1958.
And to do what?
To cut a disc. And I have a personal interest in this because I did work for a short period with Percy Phillips' nephew. And we pinned the date down to the 12th of July because the Orange men were having a march, the Battle of the Boyne March in Liverpool, which was very popular in those days, and they walked past this house with their bands and noise. So I don't know how the recording went on when all this was going on in the background.
And this is when they did what? That'll be the day?
That'll be the day.
And in spite of
all the danger. And the recording studio was at the back of the house. Now as we look at the house, it looks fairly small, but it's not. I think it was 8 rooms in here, and the recording studio was way at the back of the house, I believe.
Yeah. And this recording was something that they'd done privately. They paid for this, didn't they?
They paid for it, yes. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was probably a lot of money to them in those days.
Yes.
The exact amount I can't remember. I think it was something like £0.50, which, you know, money is 2 and 6pence or 12.5 pence, isn't it, today?
Yes. And they each took turns of owning the disc, I think.
There's a story behind that, isn't there, where it eventually ended up.
Yes, with John Dufflow, the pianist. So the 5 members who were here were John Lennon, Paul McCartney,
George Harrison,
Colin Hanton
and John Dufflow, yes.
Yes.
That's it.
Yes. And one of them at one stage lent it to the Loon Laundry, and it was played over the tannoy at the Loon Laundry in Crosby.
I believe it was indeed on Liverpool Road, Crosby. That's right, near Merchant Taylor School.
So this was a little private recording. You just made your
a private recording.
I mean, a bit one up from what they had in a fairground, but not a really proper professional studio.
That's right. A young Ken Dodge used to come here and used to record his act and his jokes here, and then play them back at home in Nossie Ash, which is about 3 miles down the road.
Yeah.
For his act, yes.
So it was great that this happened here. So whereas one Phillips made the grade in Memphis and did so much, Sam Phillips, Percy Phillips started things off here.
Did his here as well. And I have to say this, to get a personal bit in, even a young Ray O'Brien came here and recorded Peggy Sue by Buddy Holly. Not just Ray O'Brien. I only lived about a mile away down here towards the ice rink, which is further down on the left. And the young kids used to come here, so it wasn't just bands and Ken Dodds that came here. It was local youngsters that come along, pay their £0.50 and sing their song, and you got your little desk. I don't know what's happened to mine, Spencer.
And so, Ray, I'm looking forward to reading about your own recording career in perhaps your next book.
You never know, Spencer.
Yeah, and you're doing a lot of valiant work at the moment, I think, for the city.
Thank you.
Yeah, really trying to establish and get plaques up everywhere, aren't you?
Yes, recognition for the city and for the Beatles, of course.
Yeah, well, good luck with all that.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll meet up again soon.
Thank you.
And we're now going to leave this busy Kensington area, go right down into the centre of Liverpool to Liverpool World Museum and have a look at their brand new exhibition, The Beat Goes On, and it certainly does. We're here at the Beat Goes On exhibition at Liverpool World Museum, and we're going to look at the Beatles related parts of it. This part here relates to the 1950s. There's a Beatles question here. The Quarrymen played at the Cavern 7th of August 1957 without Paul. Why? Because he was at scout camp, I think. Let's have a look. He was at scout camp. And around here we've got artists who were very big in the late 1950s, Russ Hamilton, Frankie Vaughan, the guy who did the high kick and sang Green Door, and the beautiful Lita Rosa there, wonderful record, Man in a Raincoat, How Much Is That Doggy in the Window was a #1, and a fantastic stage dress that she wore. And we're moving here to the rock and roll side of things. At first there was Skiffle, and there was Buddy Holly playing at the Philharmonic Hall in March 1958. That really influenced the Merseybeat musicians. They went there, saw the Fender Stratocaster and thought, we can become a beat group too. Bits about Lonnie Donegan and stuff there. Billy Fury, his first guitar. And we move around here to Liverpool in the early 60s, and indeed Hamburg in the early 60s in Liverpool. A very nice display, colourful display here. We've got Paul Murphy, who was a Liverpool singer and musician who helped with the Beatles recording sessions in Hamburg. He says the Liverpool sound has got a lot to thank Hamburg for. Over here, there's a particularly interesting exhibition here, a programme here from the Albany Theatre in Maghull. And you'll see that Ken Dodd is the top of the bill there. Dennis Smurden, who's the person just above him, was an opera singer, and the Beatles act number 10 there. Now, this was a show that the Beatles did disastrously on. They didn't want to be there. The audience didn't want them. And it's just lucky that Brian Epstein didn't go to that show, but went to see them at the Cavern on the 9th of November, 1961. Moving over this way, you've got some pictures of the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton that we've talked about, the Mardi Gras Club, the Iron Door in Liverpool, important clubs there. There was a group on Merseyside called Carl Terry and the Rocking Cruisers, and when they appeared on stage, they'd have these yellow jackets on and then turn around to the camera like that and have Rocking Cruisers written on the back. And that's how they performed. That actually comes out of my wardrobe. I was never a member of the Rocking Cruisers, but I've had that jacket for years and years. And then you've got magazines like Disc and Merseybeat and such, all of which were terribly influential in pushing the Merseybeat music. And if we come over this way, we've actually got a stage. This is the stage that the Quarrymen were on when they played St Peter's Garden Fete in Woolton in the summer of 1957. They've only got space for half the stage in here, but when the brand new museum opens in a couple of years' time, we're going to have the whole of that stage there. And here's an item that I've never seen before, and it particularly intrigues me because that is a jacket of Pete Best's. And Pete Best wore that when he recorded My Bonnie with the Beatles and Tony Sheridan in Hamburg in 1961. And so that's an exciting jacket there. And we move up here to this display here. Here's an early picture of Ringo Starr with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes when they did the season at Butlins. The Beatles never played Butlins. A lot of the Merseybeat groups did, but John Lennon said it'd be like playing Belson or something like that. That was his famous quote about it. He just wouldn't entertain the idea of playing in a holiday camp. And here we've got one of, well, you recognise the style, one of Pete Frame's famous family trees. And indeed, one of his very famous ones, this, because this is his family tree of the Beatles. And I don't think until anyone did this that people realised that there were so many different lineups from the Quarrymen right down to the Beatles, as we know it, John, Paul, George and Ringo, some 5 years later. There were just so many lineups of the group. And what particularly fascinates me is that George Harrison at one stage had had enough. Didn't think the Quarrymen were getting a lot of dates, so he actually went and played in the Les Stewart Quartet. He didn't get many dates with the Les Stewart Quartet, and he came back to the Quarrymen again. But if the Les Stewart Quartet had had a few more bookings, he might never have rejoined the Quarrymen, and we might never have had the Beatles as we know it. And we come around the corner here to another display. This features some intriguing photographs and quotes about the Beatles, and I love this one here. This is the Beatles screaming back at their fans at the Liverpool Empire in 1963, probably on the Roy Orbison tour, I would think, but that's absolutely fantastic. And we're moving over now to a really special item, I think, but passing some very glamorous costumes on the way, because this exhibition goes right the way through to the 21st century. We've already seen Billy Fury's first guitar, and now we come to a section that's called Absolute Beginners. And these are first guitars of well-known people, including Stuart Sutcliffe. Now, Stuart Sutcliffe was with the Beatles, and when he was paid for a painting that he'd done for the John Moores exhibition, he bought a bass guitar with it and, of course, used it in Hamburg and indeed in some Liverpool gigs as well. But he actually had an acoustic guitar before that, so he was interested in music, and there's Stuart Sutcliffe's acoustic guitar. I've never seen that before, and that's a terrific item. There's just so much in this exhibition. It covers, well, 6-7 decades of Liverpool music. And here you see the poster for Help that the Beatles have, and although they're doing semaphore on that, it doesn't actually spell help. And you've got a jacket there that was used as a kind of prototype for John Lennon. They made different ones later, and that was in connection with the film Help as well. We move over here. Styling and fashion, naturally Lita Rose are involved in that. Our old friends Jerry and the Pacemakers there. Les Maguire, we were talking to him the other day on the ferry across the Mersey, and there they are taken in Liverpool. And here we've got some Beatle jackets, the standard Beatle jackets, the sort of things that we all know and love there. They date from 1963. And when Cilla Black was on TV and she sang You're My World, you may remember her standing rigid and singing the song. Well, here's her dress, Cilla Black's You're My World dress there. A lovely item, and she did look great in it. And we move on to another part of the exhibition now. And we've got here a display mainly of cavern memorabilia, really. The cavern bricks that were put on sale for charity. So that's an actual brick from the cavern. Everyone paid £5 for those bricks for charity. May, of course, have come from the toilet. We don't know, but it's a genuine cavern brick. The Cavern Club, they used to have the calendars there, as you can see. And the order of service there we've got that was done at the cathedral when John Lennon died. And the city was so emotional at that particular time. Here we've got some photographs of the cavern, the Beatles shop, the Hard Day's Night Hotel, the piano and the Beatles story. And we come around here, and here's the bed-in that John and Yoko had, the famous bed-in that was front page news everywhere in Montreal in 1969, and they recorded Give Peace a Chance at that time. They must have had a very big hotel room because they had about 50 people in the room when they recorded it. And going back 6 years to an earlier session that John Lennon was involved in, the With the Beatles album, which is when he did Twist and Shout, you've got the jacket that he wore there. So the jacket that John Lennon wore when he recorded Twist and Shout, absolutely fantastic. And various other bits of Beatle memorabilia there. A wonderful cover there for the Life magazine when you can see they'd all got moustaches. I mean, the thing about the Beatles is that they kept changing their looks so often, and they never look uncool. They always look cool, whatever they do. And 1967 was also the Summer of Love, and one of the Beatles' contributions to the Summer of Love was that wonderful song, All You Need Is Love. And here we've got a wonderful mural that's been done on that. As you can see, it relates to many of the things too in the Yellow Submarine film as well. And All You Need Is Love is the perfect way to end the Beatles section here at the Beat Goes On exhibition at Liverpool World Museum. Coincidentally, we're coming to the end of the Beatles Merseyside now, and we'll end it where it all began, in the heart of the city. Just a word about those Super Lamb bananas that we keep seeing all over the place. The original big yellow Super Lamb banana was erected in Liverpool as a comment on genetic engineering about 10 years ago. At present there are another 118 Super Lamb bananas, all gaily painted and scattered all over the city. In fact, you can't get away from them. You might wonder what the Beatles made of them, because in the Beatles' days most of the statues would have been of war heroes. And being a man of peace, John Lennon did not think that war heroes should be recognised in that way. So we're here in the heart of the city now. In fact, Lime Street Station is only across the road. And I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Beatles Merseyside. We have in fact been all over Merseyside. We've been to some marvellous places, I think, talked to some intriguing people and had a lot of good times. And I think it's increased my knowledge of the Beatles, so I hope it's increased your knowledge of the Beatles as well. And I think we've found out a few things that have never been known before. My name is Spencer Lee. Thanks for watching the Beatles Merseyside. Do come and visit us in Liverpool sometime, and goodbye.